Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and today we have a fun video I've been wanting to make for a little while. The most iconic abilities, boss abilities in WoW's history. And I figured what better way to do this than with all reliable a tier list. So I asked my buddy Frank to make this tier list with like 100 iconic raid boss abilities from all back to vanilla in WoW's history. Now, it was somewhat arbitrary which abilities I put in here. I went through every boss, and for most, raids, I tried to make sure we had at least a few mechanics represented. I will say there's a decent chance that Classic, Cataclysm, WoD, and Mop have a little bit. Those are ones where I'm more likely to have missed an iconic ability because those weren't those expansions I wasn't raiding in, whereas the other ones I was. So without further ado, let's name the tiers real quick. So we've got, as always, S through F. I wanted to still have a lot of tiers, but almost everything that's on this list is good. There's only going to be a few that go in the F tier for iconically bad. All the other tiers are good. It's just we have to have some separation between, just the historic abilities, the ones that are important, cool for WoW's history, for ratings history, all the way up to the iconic and turbo iconic tiers. We've got two iconic tiers, but one is the, in caps and with the exclamation point. So hopefully this dispels any confusions you'd have about what the tiers mean. So let's start off at the beginning, where we have Onyxia's Deep Breath from the very first raid. Ability where the boss would go up and fly across the room, and it'd say Onyxia takes a deep breath, and then she'd breathe across the room, and it'd kill you if you were standing in it. Now, this ability obviously doesn't hold up particularly well in modern WoW, but I think this actually should do pretty well, because when you think about WoW's history, I mean, so much. There's the iconic 50 DKP minus video about deep breaths, the crash out there, one of the first ever recorded raid leader crash outs, and I think the ability was just, it makes a lot of sense. Onyxia is a dragon, introduced, I think, also the dragons, don't be in front of or behind the dragon mechanic, which was super sick. But this is I tried to do basically one mechanic per boss. There are a few bosses where I took two, but usually we just did one mechanic per boss. So this is just deep breath. I'm going to go all the way up to A tier for Deep Breath, I think, which is going to be pretty rare for these classic mechanics. A lot of them are kind of whatever. But yeah, Deep Breath, it's hard to not put it all the way up in A tier. S tier is probably going to be reserved for ones that have a combination of flavor and gameplay that appeals to me, and we're probably not going to find that until we get to at least Legion. But I don't know. I haven't pre-planned where everything's going, so this may be a little inconsistent. This might change on the fly. Up next is Baron Geddon's Living Bomb. Another ability that doesn't do all that much. I wanted to pick a Molten Core ability, and there weren't a whole lot of ones that really jumped out to me. Living Bomb, though, it made it into the Fire Mage kit in various incarnations since then. I'm gonna put this one in C. It's historic. It's cool. It's not bad. There are some mechanics on here where it's like, okay, yeah, this was a blunder. This is not fun to play against, and this is certainly not that. But at least for me personally, this isn't one. Nor did this raid really have any mechanics that jumped up beyond, I would say, the C tier of iconicness. Despite the fact that, of course, Molten Core, as a whole, is definitely an iconic raid. All right, up next is a mechanic that. There are a few where I sort of cheated and they're not really boss mechanics, but this one was one that I felt qualified here, which is Shadow Flame. So this was a mechanic that was seen in Blackwing Lair, where you needed to have an Onyxia scale cloak to be immune to or reduce damage from the Shadow Flame mechanics on several bosses. So it's something that they've used a little bit since then. You needed the N'Zoth cloak, the Horrific Visions cloak, rather, if you're fighting N'Zoth to avoid getting MC'd. So there's been a few spots like that where it's like, okay, this item is a requirement for this. It's sort of part of the attunement process for whatever raid we're doing. But I thought this was a particularly cool way of doing it. There were a lot of attunements back in the day at the start of WoW, which I guess I should clarify as well. I didn't play a lot of Classic, I played TBC and Wrath the first time around. I played a little bit of TBC Classic, but I didn't play Classic or SOD or any of that other stuff. So if you have played those more recently than you may be more familiar with all these mechanics. But for me, largely doing them from a lot longer memory. So yeah, I'm gonna put the Shadow Flame. I'm gonna put this. I'm still gonna put this only in the C tier for a historic mechanic. Maybe it's the bottom of B tier, top of C tier for me. But yeah, we'll put it here again. The tier list is mostly an excuse to talk about these things. It's not something to get worked up about in this case. All right, up next we have one of the rare bosses that I've chosen 2 mechanics from, and it's a classic boss. But I actually thought that this was one of the coolest mechanical choices in Classic. So this is Veilastraz the Corrupt, an early boss in Blackwing Lair that introduced, I think, some of the coolest Enrage mechanics done in the early days of WoW. So up first we have Essence of the Red, which was when you pull the boss, it gives everybody in the raid the Essence of the Red buff, and then while it's active, you're pogging out. But as soon as it falls off, all of a sudden you're in big trouble. And I thought that this is a cool way to make an Enrage for a fight. It's an innovative way to do an Enrage. I kind of think they could be more creative with Enrages in current boss design, because pretty commonly there's like some soft Enrage stuff, but then the hard Enrage is just the boss casts something like an Essence of the Red again. I don't know. I feel like this mechanic's really cool. I'm going to put this all the way up in A for iconic. The other mechanic from Veilastraz is Burning Adrenaline, which is another part of the Enrage design of this fight, where the boss would apply Burning Adrenaline every 15 seconds to somebody, and it would give them like double damage and instant cast spells, but it would start draining their health and then make them explode when they died. So another thing where it's like, okay, we're getting some power out of this, and then when you die, it's bad. This was sort of echoed in Azara, the last phase of Azara, Mythic Azara. You had a similar mechanic to this. But I thought this was a really cool one. I don't think it's quite as cool as the Essence of the Red one, because I always think it's kind of annoying when people in your raid start dropping like flies fairly early on into a fight. And this also had some annoying tank swap stuff, and was some of the classic. I mean, it is certainly an iconic classic thing to have fights that randomly wanted you to have a zillion tanks or some mage or warlock tank, shenanigans. But I'm going to put this one in B for iconic. Partially haters will say just because I want to start filling up the other tiers, but it seems like a good fit for B. Also B for Burning. I guess I could go A for Adrenaline, so there you go. Something that's not going to go in C, even though it starts with 2 C's, though, is Nefarian's Class Calls. This is super iconic for me. So it's one of those mechanics where you look at it and you're like, would this work in modern WoW? Maybe not. The boss would basically pick a class, and then it would grief that class in some exciting, funny way. They actually briefly had a version of Class Calls on Echo of Neltharion. So if you did Mythic, or maybe it was even in the lower difficulties as well, Echo of Neltharion PTR testing back in Aberrus, the boss had Class Calls, which was super funny. The Evoker one, it would just start deep breathing you, it would mind control the Evoker and start deep breathing your raid. The Mage one would like poly random people or something. The Druid one, I forget, the Druid one just like random shapeshifted them into different forms. So it was really funny. But the original Class Call one had some really, really grief ones, and then some that were, whatever. There was one that like weapon durability, like broke your weapons. So like obviously on the balance side, on the annoyingness side, it's pretty high, but I'm gonna put this one all the way up in Turbo Iconic. I think this is one of the most like inspired things they've done. One of the things that is very World of Warcraft, and I'm gonna call it an S tier Turbo Iconic mechanic. All right, speaking of mechanics that griefed you, the next one we're going to talk about is Corrupted Blood, an ability from Zul'Gurub with Hakar casting this on you. Now, the mechanic itself is one thing, but of course, the iconic part of this was that you could take this debuff outside the raid and start killing people in capital cities, and this led to, there was like an epidemiology paper written about this with players griefing and some people trying to help, and I think the ability to model this to a real world pandemic is pretty sus, because people's behavior in an online game, a lot more people try to purposefully infect people in an online game than in real life. It turns out it's not a 0% people in real life, it turns out, but it's a lot lower than it is in World of Warcraft. Either way, I think this one's also a really iconic mechanic. The history on this one is so high. I think I'm going to put this up in A, because I feel like it's part of it's such a deep part of the fabric of WoW's history, like Deep Breath from Onyxia. I don't think the mechanic itself, S needs to be good on multiple levels, whereas Corrupted Blood was kind of accidentally iconic because of the the griefing that happened with it. So yeah, we're going up into A tier for Corrupted Blood. But all right, we move on to the Ruins of Ahn'Qiraj and the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj. So there's a boss in here called the Bug Trio that had 3 different bosses, and the order you killed them in would matter. It would change the mechanics of the fight, and it would change the loot of the fight as well. This is a mechanic that has been used somewhat future into WoW, which, by the way, anytime there's a pretty similar mechanic in the future, unless it's iconic in its own right, I'm not going to include it in this tier list. So, for instance, the Death Order from the Bug Trio, there's similar mechanics in like Ulduar with the trio there that I'm not going to include. Council of Blood, and I'm not going to include those because it's a pretty similar mechanic to here, unless there's something transformational about it. But yeah, I thought this was a really cool idea. The fact that you get different loot from it's pretty inspired as well. You could see the idea of like making the harder ones give you better loot if you do it in the harder order, which I think is how it worked in Ulduar. I'm not 100% sure on that. That's something my memory is a little foggy on, but I think that was how that mechanic evolved. And I don't really know how it worked in Classic in terms of like whether there was a desirable but harder combination to do it in terms of getting loot. But this was something where the ability to sort of build your own boss by doing things in a different order has been some of the coolest boss fights that they've made across the game's history. You can see this design as a primordial version of like Lei Shen, Siegecrafter Blackfuse, bosses where you can choose how the fight turns out. And I think this boss is probably one that this would probably be the easiest of the like mechanics we've got so far, maybe besides the Veilastraz ones, to not know about, compared to how widely known some of these other stories are and some of these other mechanics are. But I think it's actually really good and really good like design and a really important part of the design history of cool World of Warcraft raid bosses. So I'm going to throw this one up in A as well. You can't stop me. There's a decent chance that this tier list is going to end up very top heavy. Something I usually try and avoid with my tier lists is there's some tier list makers out there where you pop open their tier list and it's like S tier, S- tier, A+ tier, A tier, and then like B tier and C tier each have 1 entrance each. And I usually try to avoid doing that. There's a chance that's not going to happen this time around because any of the mechanics I even selected to get into this list, most of them either were cool, or there are a few that are intentionally in here because they were really bad, iconic. All right, our next mechanic is from Twin Emperors, also in Ahn'Qiraj. The idea here is you got to separate the bosses or else they're going to cause problems if they're too close to each other. A mechanic that has been used several times ever since. We see this kind of all the time done whenever there's 2 bosses. We see it on Trial of Valor, the Odin encounter with Himdall and Herja. Other bosses that don't immediately jump to my mind, but that's a fairly common thing for them to do with 2 target fights. Oh, Cauldron of Carnage here in Liberation of Undermine tier, which, also uses this. So definitely a cool mechanic, although I will say I tend to not have that much fun on these fights. That being said, there are some classes that really enjoy these fights, right? Where it's like, the Warlocks, the dot classes really, really love fights where you've got some spread cleave. Coven of Savara, I think, in Taurus the Burning Throne. Although I don't think that it actually worked on this fight in particular, because I think that like one of these bosses was immune to magic and one to physical or something. I could just be completely making that up. Either way, this is a historic mechanic, but it's not going to climb any higher than that for me. All right, up next is Viscidus, which has a very strange mechanic where you had to freeze the boss by only hitting it with frost abilities in phase 1. It like didn't matter how much damage they did. It was just that they were frost abilities. And then in phase 2, you needed to hit it with only physical abilities to actually shatter it. And then it would split into a bunch of globs. You'd kill the globs, and it would reform eventually based on how many of those globs you could kill. Super strange fight. We've seen some kind of similar ideas to the whole like shattering into blobs, kill the blobs, and then the boss reforms. Immersius at the start of Siege of Orgrimmar has a similar mechanic to that, but it's still the idea of like this boss, you only care about doing frost damage, and then you only care about doing physical damage, is super strange. I'm not going to put this in iconically bad. I'm going to put it in historic. Again, I don't think this is a good mechanic or anything, but it's definitely a part of WoW's history and an iconic boss ability. All right, finally in Ahn'Qiraj, we have Cthulhu itself, which featured a mechanic of going inside the boss's stomach, which It's been used a little bit since then. There have been some fights where you go kind of inside the boss. Yogg Saron being a good example of a boss like that. And then there's obviously a lot of bosses where there's like a downstairs phase of some kind, although physically going inside the boss is, I think, pretty rare besides Cthulhu and Yogg Saron. I guess you go inside the heart of Yasharj on the Garrosh encounter, so maybe it's kind of an old god through line there. On N'Zoth, you don't really go inside the boss. I guess you go into the Psychus phase, which you make an argument. So yeah, maybe this is just an old god mechanic that they've got there. But yeah, I'm going to put this one... This one is definitely obviously, it's not like that cool mechanically in terms of what you're doing, but I think flavorfully this one's very cool. I think it's good enough to go up into B tier as well. Like, you're literally going inside, the monster to slay it from within. I think that is cool enough, even though it's not particularly interesting when you're actually are looking at, like, okay, what's the gameplay of this entail? I'm going to put it into B tier. All right, up next, we move on to Naxxramas, which features Hygen the Unclean, sort of one of the first dances. I mean, people literally called it the dance boss, where the boss would have like 4 different sections of the room that would, fire the lava at you, and you needed to dodge between them. Not a lot of classic bosses had this style of design, which is kind of, reactive, based on how you move your character. Most bosses were a lot simpler and kind of more old school, even turn-based game sort of vibes, not so much twitch reactions and controlling your character. Of course, it was very primordial, not like some of the modern mechanics. Nowhere close to some of the modern mechanics that are like this, but you could definitely see how this spawned a lineage of mechanics like it ever since then that have required us to dance. So I'm going to put this up all the way into A tier again. I don't think the mechanic itself is super strong, but it's one of the ones where, in terms of like the mechanics that shared its DNA that have come since, have been a crucial part of fun boss mechanics that they've done for us. All right, up next, it's Patchwork. Patchwork's iconic mechanic is... Nope, Patchwork doesn't have iconic mechanics. Patchwork is just a boss that you attacked, and you compared your raid's damage per second to the boss's health bar, and you hoped that you had the good side of that. And back, at the time, that was quite a challenging check to do. But Patchwork is another boss where it spawned a history of bosses. Now, since then, all the Patchwork fights have been a lot more mechanically intensive than Patchwork, sure. And usually these days we actually call them... You'll hear most raiders call these sorts of fights now like sludge fist fights, because that's usually the way that the Blizzard makes them these days, is that, like, okay, it's mostly a DPS check, but there are 1 or 2 difficult and important mechanics that you need to be looking out for as well. But Patchwork is definitely the originator of this style of, like, yep, it's a brutal DPS check. That's what you're here for. There are some bosses where you're here for the mechanics, and there are some bosses where you're here for the numbers check, and this boss is all the way on the numbers check side of things. I'm going to put this one also up in A tier. I know it's not even a mechanic, but when I think about, like, how vital this is to the game's legacy, the Patchwork fights and their descendants, I'm again inclined to rate it very highly. All right, up next is another boss mechanic that has spawned a lineage of great mechanics. Part of the reason Naxxramas is such a fondly remembered raid, I'd say, is because there are so many bosses like this that really defined types of fights that WoW would make, although they largely backed off this mechanic until more recently, when they've started doing a lot of fights like this. So this is Polarity Shift. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but half your raid gets one color, half your raid gets red, half your raid gets blue. They got to split up, and then the boss would shift periodically, and you got to go to your side with your same color. Now, obviously, it's more complicated than that, but Sprocketmonger Lockenstock very clearly... I mean, it's literally also positive and negative, but we've seen, Silken Court has a twist on this. Star Augur, I mean, even the Star Augur style of mechanic is inspired by and a descendant of this, a different version that is transformative enough that, spoiler alert, it's further down this list as well in its own right. But I'm going to put this one up in... Honestly, this is maybe an S tier mechanic as well. This is either the top of A tier or it's going into S tier. Like, playing around these sorts of fights where, you've got a polarity shift going on, it's been a pretty important thing, and I would say a pretty fun part of gameplay is figuring out how to handle these different fights that have had it. I'm going to leave S tier clean for now. I'm going to put it up at the top of A tier. Clean, I guess, except for Nefarian up there. But yeah, we'll put this one up into A tier for iconic. So you'll note nothing in the F tier yet. I'm going to have a very hard time putting anything this old into F tier because just like, I don't know, I mean, like, there were a lot of horrible mechanics in Classic, but it was Classic, right? Like, you got to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's most of the horrible Classic mechanics didn't make it into this tier list, right? Whereas there are some iconically bad mechanics from more recent expansions that do for me. All right, our next mechanic is also from Naxxramas. It's from Sapphiron, who's right before Kel'Thuzad, and the idea is somebody gets ice blocked, and you got to hide behind him, or else you're going to be in big trouble. There's been a few places where this style of mechanic is used, right? Having to line a boss behind something. Lining behind an ice-blocked player actually was also directly used in the Sindragosa encounter in ICC a couple of expansions later. But we see this sort of thing from time to time. It's also a fairly common dungeon mechanic. It was used in... Gosh, there was a TBC dungeon, I think, where you had to, like, lining the boss on the Arcane Explosion cast. Whenever there's, like, pillars, that kind of stuff, you might need to line behind it. I'm not usually a huge fan of this sort of mechanic. I think the absolute worst incarnation of it was Queen Ajara, where you're, like, not line of sighting anything except for something that your weak aura is ticking down and telling you, like, hey, line of sight the next arcane missiles now. But I think the initial version of it was cool, you know. But I usually don't like lining because, you know, then you don't get to press your buttons. That's a little bit less fun. So I'm gonna put this one in the B tier. I mean, it's definitely an iconic mechanic, and you know, it's spawned a bunch of other mechanics since then. It's important, but I'm not as much of a fan of the gameplay that it creates. Maybe I'll put this down in C actually for historic, because yeah, I don't like line of sighting. All right, we move on to World of Warcraft's first expansion pack, TBC, the Burning Crusade. And we've got Gruul's Lair up first in Tier 4. A bunch of different places you could go in Tier 4. You could go to Gruul's Lair, Magtheridon's Lair, or Karazhan as your first raids of the expansion. But we're going to start with Gruul's Lair, and the mechanic here is Shatter, where the boss would, like, slow everybody down, and then you're getting increasingly slowed, and you have to spread out from everybody, and then at the end of that, you take damage if you're close to other people, but if you can spread enough, you don't take too much damage. Very hectic mechanic, very, you know, doing this in a raid of 25 people as it was back then, with everybody being as bad as we were back then was quite tough. So I think this is a pretty iconic mechanic. I'm not going to put this all the way up into the A tier of iconicness. I'm going to put this into B tier. There's sort of a classic buff, and then that buff is a little bit weaker for TBC and Wrath, and then a little bit weaker after that for these mechanics. So yeah, we'll put this one into B tier. Up next, we move to Karazhan, one of the most iconic raids, and sort of a shame that I've only picked 2 mechanics from this raid, because there are actually a lot of really cool mechanics in Karazhan, but this list was getting super long. So I want to pick one from the Opera House encounter, which in and of itself was an innovative design where it would rotate which actual boss it was. But I'm just going to choose the Little Red Riding Hood mechanic of run away, little girl, run away, which has ever since then been immortalized in the DBM add-on as, you know, when you get targeted by something you're supposed to run away from, the boss would turn you into Little Red Riding Hood and start chasing after you, the big bad wolf, and you had to run away from the boss. Instant S tier for me. It's, you know, one of the most turbo iconic parts of WoW's history. Again, immortalized into an add-on for good reason. Yeah, that's the place for this. All right, up next is Flame Wreath, which Shade of Iran would cast this, and it would put a Flame Wreath around you. The Flame Wreath itself would be a nasty dot, and then if you touched the walls of Flame Wreath, if you moved, you would explode the raid. Or I think if you died in the Flame Wreath as well, it would explode the raid. Turbo iconic mechanic as well. This one, there was a song about it, like, I will not move when Flame Wreath is cast or the raid blows up. Super nostalgic mechanic for me. I'm going to throw this one up in S tier as well. I don't know. I feel like it's only fair to Karazhan that if I only pick 2 mechanics from the, 13 boss raid or whatever it was, that they're both going up there in the S tier. All right, we move on to tier 5. In this tier, we had Serpentine Cavern and Tempest Keep. There were a couple of interesting mechanics in Serpentine Cavern that could have gone on this list now that I think about it, but I've chosen a mechanic from Tempest Keep to represent this tier, which was Kel'Thuz's legendary weapons mechanic. Kel'Thuz had a lot of iconic mechanics. The gravity lapse, super cool. A lot of cool stuff this tier. Again, a lot of mechanics that are great mechanics that don't make this list, which I'm sorry about. Let me know in the comments which mechanic you're most aggrieved that I didn't put in this list. But legendary weapons were extremely cool. Legendaries were not something that players usually saw if you played back then. You know, a couple of very dedicated people would have seen, you know, Atiesh or Thunder Fury or some of the old legendaries back in the day. But I guess Atiesh was maybe an artifact. I think about it. I don't know. I don't remember. Obviously, these were all there were a lot of like literally legendary weapons, and that stories were told about them, but not a lot of players had them. But the Kel'Thas fight was really interesting in that you started the fight by killing off these weapons, and then you could loot them and use them during the fight. These different legendary weapons that interacted with the fight mechanics for the rest of the fight. Very cool design. Not something that they do an awful lot of since then, although, you know, looting something on a boss fight and then using it has evolved, usually not to be an actual item anymore, but to be an extra action button, something like that, some buff that you get. We see it pretty much every raid tier, even on Gallywix throwing bombs, Ansurek, the essences, right, are sort of like that, where it's, hey, you pick something up, and then after an amount of time, or when you move somewhere, or when you extra action button, you do something. So sort of descendants of legendary weapons, but I think legendary weapons are a really cool way of doing it. You know, items are something people understand. The fact that it's like, oh, I get this item, I literally equip it, replacing whatever my actual weapon is, and then use this against Kel'Thas. I'm going to put this one all the way up into the A tier. I think a very iconic mechanic. Okay, we move on to tier 6, which featured the battle for Mount Hyjal in the Caverns of Time, and also we had the Black Temple. So I'm going to start with Archimonde at the end of Mount Hyjal, where it would knock you up in the air, and you had to like use a thing that the fight gave you to not die to the fall damage when you landed. Extremely cool mechanic. Getting like knocked up into the air and then having something to not die to fall damage is something they've actually used in a few other spots, or just in general, playing with jumping and then avoiding dying to that. You can see it in fights, even kind of like Maiden, where you jump into the hole in the middle of the room in Legion, places like that. There are mechanics that have played with fall damage and dying like that and jumping and stuff, but this was, I think, a pretty cool way of doing it. So I'm gonna put this in B. I don't think it's as cool necessarily or iconic as the ones above it, but definitely pretty cool. And then we have over in Black Temple, Terran Gorefiend, the Shadow of Death mechanic. So this one, you would literally die and turn into like a spirit, and then you had to fight off these evil spirits that were coming at the raid, and they were going to do bad stuff if the people that died and turned into these shadows of death didn't use the new abilities that they got correctly against it. A little bit of a weird design. And any of these kinds of mechanics where it's like, hey, you get these new abilities, it's a little bit weird because like you don't really get to practice them or read them beforehand, so you kind of have to like pre-learn, like, okay, this ability that goes into my number 1 spot does this ability that goes into my number 2 spot does this, and like, here's how I'm supposed to do this. A little bit that side of things I've always found to be a little bit clunky with any of these sorts of mechanics, or the vehicle mechanics that have been sort of the successor to this. But I would still say pretty cool effect. I'm going to also throw this one in the B tier. All right, up next we move to Zul-Aman. Now, Zul-Aman, I've chosen a mechanic that's not really a boss mechanic again, which is something I tried to do as little as possible, but there are a few sort of raid-wide mechanics that made this list, which, you know, whatever. I can do what I want. It's my tier list. I've gone with the Warbear. So if you completed a timed run of Zul-Aman within a certain amount of time, you like save the hostages and then get a Warbear as a result, a very iconic mount. This thing I think was pretty cool, introducing the idea of a timed run. You could argue that this was something that then evolved into stuff like challenge modes and Mythic Plus even. Although I guess Culling of Stratholme, or not, I guess it was Culling of Stratholme had this, not Stratholme. Did old Stratholme have this? I think it was just Culling, which came out after Zul-Aman. So yeah, maybe this was the first time there was like a timed thing in WoW's history. I'm sure I'm forgetting something else that was timed before this, but either way, this one was in the raid. So very, very cool design. I would say pretty iconic. I'm feeling B tier iconicness for this one as well, though. It's hard to put my finger on why. We're going on a little B tier streak here. All right, nothing jumped out at me from Sunwell Plateau, so we move on to the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. And we start off with Naxxramas. One of the most beloved WoW raids up until that point was recycled as tier 9 in Wrath of the Lich King. And not really, it was sort of, I guess this was maybe flavorfully, but it was resurrected as a shell of its former self. It was a historically easy raid. It had some pretty cool things. There was pretty cool achievements where it's like complete this deathless in 25 or 10 for a special title. Obviously, people that have played, classic Wrath of the Lich King Classic will be more familiar with that mechanic than I am, having not played that. But yeah, I don't know. Taking an old raid and just running it back again. Making a raid as iconic. So the thing is, at this point in time, such a small percentage of WoW players had ever played old Naxxramas, and raids were something that used to be, for a very small set of the player base, they used to be gated behind tough attunements, such as the original Naxxramas, and a lot of the TBC raids past tier 4, you needed to attune in a pretty convoluted way. You needed to gather 40 and then later 25 people to do these raids. And by ICC, they really were making this push to make raiding more accessible, which I applaud. I think that made a lot of sense. I think raiding is sick, and it's good that more people get to do it. But they ended up with recycling this raid in particular, taking an iconically difficult and prestigious and historic part of WoW's history and delivering a very diluted version of it. So I'm going to put this as our first entrance into the iconically bad territory. Again, a lot of good reasons to make the game more accessible for people to raid in, but I think that the particular way that they did it with Naxxramas left a lot to be desired. All right, up next we move to the Eye of Eternity, which featured vehicle combat, something that would, again, you can see the earlier versions of WoW bosses where you mind control something, you got a pet to control, those sorts of things. But Wrath of the Lich King introduced vehicles, and they started to get used. They were used further on down the line. We used vehicles in Ulduar at the start of that raid fairly extensively, and ever since then there have been a lot of fights where you hop in a turret or something like that to do vehicle stuff. But this raid, after the later phase of it was, I think, every single person in your raid was on a dragon, and you were flying around, and the healer dragons are different than the tank dragons, were different than the DPS dragons, and they all had different abilities. I have similar concerns with this as with the Shadow of Death, where it's okay, anytime there's a vehicle that you're kind of thrust onto mid-encounter that has some abilities, it's a little bit weird to learn them mid-fight. More recently, when they've done stuff like this, they have given you access to the vehicles in some trash section, so you can learn it there. And I think that's a good way of doing this, but not something that you got to really do. I guess technically in Eye of Eternity, you got to, I think, board some discs during the trash section at the start of the raid. Or maybe that was in the version of Eye of Eternity that's in the Dragon Soul raid, now that I think about it. But yeah, either way, that's an important mechanic. I would say it's less cool and still fiddly compared to Shadow of Death. So I'm going to put this one down in the historic tier as well, because again, there are problems that I have just design-wise with doing this sort of thing. All right, up next we move to Ulduar. After the somewhat disappointing start of Wrath of the Lich King for raiders, Ulduar was at the time seen as, again, one of the best raids of all time, something that was full of really exciting, interesting raid bosses, although compared to ICC, which would follow at that expansion, it didn't quite have the inherent historicity of bosses like Arthas and Sindragosa and stuff. But Ulduar introduced hard modes. So before Ulduar, you didn't have, heroic and normal difficulty of bosses. The only way that you could really have a hard mode, I guess you could argue the Order of Death mattering on the Bug Trio back in Encourage was sort of a hard mode, but Ulduar introduced some really creative hard modes on a lot of different bosses. There would be different ways of activating them on different bosses. On some bosses it was easy as pressing a button, and then the boss being super hard, which makes an appearance in the next boss we're going to talk about. But on other bosses, there were a lot of other different ways of doing this. Yogg-Saron itself, at the end of that raid, you had 4 different keepers that you had beaten earlier in the raid, and you could tell them, I want your help or I don't want your help on this boss. And depending on the amount you used, you got a different difficulty encounter. Different mechanics were countered by the different keepers helping you. Some bosses, it was a timed event thing, right? Thorim, can you get through fast enough to then do the hard mode version of the fight? Some bosses, it was a DPS check on XT, whatever the numbers are, Deconstructor. The boss would drop its heart out during these intermission phases, and if you could kill the heart, if you could meet the DPS check, you would trigger it over over into the Heartbreaker hard mode. A lot of really inventive designs here, and I understand why it's not necessarily something that was sustainable, but I thought this was the coolest thing ever. I thought that, when they switched instead to having normal and heroic be a toggle, like, I get it, but wow, these were awesome. I'm going to put this up into Turbo Iconic, where I think that hard modes like this, where you activate them in some certain way, are super cool. And one of the things that I've liked about the mega dungeons that they've done is that a lot of them have featured some kind of hard mode that's sort of similar to this. Like the Return to Karazhan, you had a timed hard mode activation where you had to kill each boss within like 5 minutes of each other, I think. There are like Deathless Run hard modes that you needed to do in the Mechagon, Operation Mechagon, that featured the last boss having a memory game mechanic to it. So a lot of cool stuff that I think are in that hard mode space that has largely been now relegated to these mega dungeons, these sort of prestige mode runs of these mega dungeons. But still, I think hard modes are super cool. And one of the coolest hard modes was the Mimiron fight, where you'd literally press a button. And again, this is one of those mechanics where the mechanic itself is, looking back on it, it's kind of whatever. There'd be a lot of fire that spawned throughout the fight. But the part about this that for me was so iconic is the way that it featured into the boss lines, where the boss is just going like, why would you push that button? And start, yelling at you about it. Extremely funny, extremely cool. I'm going to put this one all the way up in A as well. This the firefighter version of the Mimiron fight. Super iconic hard mode. I'm going to, even though I've already done the hard modes, this is on my list as well. Whatever, you can't stop me. My tier list. I guess you'd close this video, but please don't. Next one is Deathbringer Sourfang with the Blood Beast. And by the way, from now on, now that we have hard modes or heroic modes on these raids, because ICC introduced doing heroic instead of just having hard modes that Ulduar did. From now on, almost all of these fights are heroic mechanics or mythic mechanics when we get there, right? Like I'm usually that's the versions of the fight that I'm talking about are the hardest versions of these fights, because to me those are kind of the canon versions of the fights in my head. So Deathbringer Sourfang, we had these Blood Beasts, which were kind of annoying to play against, and it was sort of one of these mechanics where the way that it killed you was by just healing the boss up if you screwed it up, which is it was kind of funny, again, pretty frustrating, and kind of a worse way to go than just the boss killing you. It was the boss, healing in your face. There's something about it where, you think about a boss fight, us healing ourselves would be really frustrating if I was a raid boss, but a raid boss doing it to us just feels like that's unfair. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. And Blood Beasts, were kind of a good example of that. But I think a pretty historic mechanic. Compared, now that I've talked about some of these other mechanics here, I don't think this should go any higher than the C tier. But to me, this is one of the big mechanics that I remember about ICC doing heroic progression on Deathbringer Sourfang was those Blood Beasts. All right, up next we have Blood Queen Lanethel, which featured a very flavorful vampiric bite mechanic where the boss would turn you into a vampire, and then you needed to turn other people into vampires to sate your vampiric thirst. And you'd get I think you got some buffs for doing it, but then you also needed to, it would sort of exponentially spread, where those people would then need to start biting people to turn them into vampires, and eventually, of course, you'd run out of it, so it was a creative and rage mechanic as well, somewhat reminiscent of the Burning Adrenaline from Veilastraz. You can start seeing a lot of these mechanics we're going to talk about later have their roots, have their, as iterations of these earlier mechanics, but I thought the Vampiric Bite mechanic was pretty cool. I'm going to put this up in the B tier for iconic. All right, up next is our first healer fight, which was Velythria Dreamwalker. Sort of a free fight. A lot of people thought of it in this tier, especially on heroic, compared to the difficulty of the bosses around it. If you could kill Deathbringer Sourfang and you had some healers with a pulse, you could usually do Velythria compared to the other bosses. But the idea of a fight that was about healers was very novel, where you win the boss fight by taking a target and healing it up to full, rather than, killing enemies. Obviously, killing enemies is a huge part of this for your DPS players, but the healers were really the heroes of this fight. This has been something they've done a little bit since then. Castle Nathria featured the Essence of the Sun King encounter, which also had an element of this. But I think this is a cool idea. Kind of wish this was something they did more, although it's a very polarizing type of fight. There are a lot of people who do not like these healer fights, including some healers, although some healers really do love them. I'm going to throw this one up in A. I think, again, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, they're really thinking outside the box in terms of designing fights. Thinking outside the box in terms of designing fights that are just completely different from an average raid boss. All right, up next is Putricide with the mutated transformation where you'd like turn into an abomination and slurp up the goop on the ground, if I remember correctly. This one, I guess it's sort of similar to, Shadow of Death mechanics and these other mechanics where you've ended up in control of something that's not your character and having to understand what to do with it. But this one, I think, had a little bit more agency about who was transformed, and also I thought was a very fun and flavorful version of this. So I'm actually going to throw this one up in A tier as well. I think this is a really good fight and a really well-designed version of this mechanic that improved on those earlier similar designs. All right, up next is the Lich King himself with Defile as a mechanic. This was a very cool mechanic that the gameplay of it is a lot worse than the iconicness of it, where it drops a puddle on the ground that you shouldn't stand in. Okay, a lot of bosses do that, but every time this ticked on you, it would grow a little bigger, and then it would tick on more people because it was growing bigger, and it could very quickly cover the entire room. Now, since then, it's not really something that they have reused. They actually did reuse it on the Jailer encounter, and then it's also a Unholy DK talent option that has fluctuated between being playable and unplayable. It's pretty good on the talent tree, although, of course, it's a very different version than the ICC version where it would, kill everything if it got full-sized. But I remember even on the Jailer fight, I think on Echo's world first Jailer kill, there's a Defile puddle that, expands to full size before despawning because it's at the end of its timer and covering the whole room, which, turbo iconic effect. The gameplay of this, I think, does hold this back. This doesn't do anything super cool gameplay-wise. Although, now that I'm looking at these other things that are up here, aside from hard modes, none of them do as well. So maybe that's a made-up rule that I made up earlier that I'm going to delete now, because it's hard to imagine calling Defile for me anything other than a turbo iconic ability, an S tier, in terms of how memorable it is as a raid mechanic. If I had to name 10 World of Warcraft boss mechanics, Defile would be one of them, so it's going into S tier for me. All right, moving right along, we enter World of Warcraft's third expansion pack, patch 4.0, the Cataclysm expansion. So again, this is one of the expansions that I did not raid during. We're going to start off with Cho'Gall's corruption mechanic, where you could actually see some of the influences that would later be when corruption was on gear, where the boss would start giving you more corruption. As you got more corruption, things got worse for you as well. And then when you max out on corruption, it's I think you got a short buff and then it was all over for you. Although maybe I'm thinking of the N'Zoth version of this mechanic. I think it worked like this on Cho'Gall as well. I'm not going to fact check myself. This video is already going to take me 7 hours to record. So if there's misinformation during this video, tough. Let me know in the comments below, engagement farming. But yeah, corruption, I think this version of the mechanic, definitely a pretty cool idea of, things are getting worse for you. You have more and more to deal with as you're getting more corrupted. There's some risk of it kind of spiraling out of control as more people in your raid are getting corrupted. They're frontaling people and causing more corruption to grow that way. And everybody's going to get full corruption if you're not careful. I'm going to throw this one up in the B tier. Up next is Sinestra, which this is an interesting boss because I think this was the first heroic-only encounter. And then also, it featured these Twilight Slicers, which have been reused since then on Helya, a very similar mechanic. But the idea here is you've got 2 orbs that are chasing people, and then a laser connecting them that's going to murder anybody that touches it. And the 2 orbs at the edge are also pulsing and doing damage, so you can't, it's hard to really easily control them into a nice small space. Helya had a very similar mechanic that was also extremely hard at the time with orbs that were connected and would, slice people in a very nasty way if you weren't careful. So yeah, I think this is a very high rated mechanic for me. Does it go up into the A tier? Be our first mechanic? I think it does go into the A tier and start our second row here in the A tier. All right, we move on to the Firelands here. The first mechanic of the Firelands. Firelands actually has a few mechanics that made my list, but the first one is just the feet on Lord Rylith. So the boss had a left foot and a right foot, and it would start walking, and you didn't want it to go into the lava, so you'd have to steer the boss by damaging its left foot and its right foot to cause the boss to turn. There was an achievement for only making it turn left as well, a Zoolander reference in that achievement. Very cool fight, very cool design. not a particularly difficult fight to, execute, but one of those things, again, where you just look at it and you're like, cool, right? Like, they're not just making 9 different, boss mobs that you attack. They're making bosses that, somebody has had an idea of what if we do this. So I'm going to throw this one up in A for iconic as well. All right, up next we have another flying boss with the Lich Resort. This one, so I guess the Malagos was sort of flying, but this one was a very fun version of flying. Unlike sort of clunky, slow vehicle flying, when you collected the feathers on a Lich Resort, you could fly kind of fast, and you had to go up in the air and do some fun flying. We've seen, I guess, evolution of this, maybe on the Tindral encounter even, the flying section of Tindral. I think this is an extremely cool and fun mechanic. I'm actually going to throw this one up in the S tier as well. I think the Lich Resort flying mechanic is some of the coolest stuff, and if you were just watching a Firelands raid, Firelands had a lot of this where it's like, wow, like the raiding is so sick, so cool. I actually briefly came back to do a little bit of raiding in Firelands and then Siege of Orgrimmar, even though I didn't really raid in these expansions, and I remember thinking like, okay, like this game has got, at the time, so much more fun, cool stuff than like any other game on the market. All right, up next is Balorok's Vital Spark. Now, this is a weird healer mechanic where basically there were like 2 abilities, one which I think was a tank mechanic, and the other which was like a dot that would go on random people, and you would heal the dots on random people, and healing those players would give you stacks of this Vital Spark, and then you would consume that by healing the tank mechanic, which was doing a bunch of damage, but also increase their max health, so you had more of a health bar to heal, and that would give you a massive increase in healing to that target. Extremely innovative fight design is one of those things where if you weren't a healer, you could not know about this mechanic doing the fight because it's a healer mechanic, and so it's not flashy. It's not the boss turning in different directions. It doesn't have a good visual for how it's working, right? It's all in the nuts and bolts, piping of the game, the hardware behind it. But I think this is an extremely cool design. Again, innovative in a different way, where it's not somebody saying like, hey, let's have a boss where you can fly. Let's have a boss where you're turning the boss left and right. But it's instead somebody thinking like, okay, what haven't we done that we can do as an interesting healer mechanic? And then somebody started cooking, and I think they cooked with this one. I'm going to throw it also up into the A tier. All right, we move in to the Dragon Soul, and I'm featuring now Twilight Onslaught on the Warmaster Blackhorn encounter. Now, I think this might have been the first soak mechanic. I'm not 100% sure. There might have been a soak before here. I was trying to look for them before this boss, and I couldn't find one, but I also gave up after looking for like 5 minutes, so I might have missed it. But either way, if there was an earlier one, let me know in the comments below. But I think this might have been the first time where the boss like shoots something at you, and if you don't have somebody get hit by it, it's very bad news. This one, it wasn't actually the Warmaster himself, but it was the Goriana, his dragon, that would assault the ship, and you needed to have somebody actually stand in the Twilight Onslaught. This mechanic has been super important for WoW because they do soaks all the time now, culminating or peaking in Tomb of Sargeras, where there were like 7 vital soaks on the last 2 bosses that made specs that were good at that extremely OP. And since then, there's been less of them, but there still are soaks all the time where you need to catch something as it's landing, and if you don't, something bad happens. Even Mugsy in the Liberation of Undermine has, you pop a mine, 3 soaks go out, and we even have a visual language in the game now where if there's a circle on the ground and a sort of plume coming up out of it, oh, somebody's supposed to go stand in that. That is a visual language that they've added to make soaks understandable and intelligible and quickly readable for players that haven't, read the dungeon journal for a specific boss or anything, because they are such a common and important mechanic to understand. And I believe it all started with the Twilight Onslaught, although I'm not 100% sure. So for that, I'm going to throw this actually again up into the A tier, based on the lineage of this mechanic being super important to how WoW raid bosses work. All right, Dragon Soul continues with Spine of Deathwing's roll mechanic. So the boss would have a left side and a right side, and whichever side had more people on it, the boss would soon roll in that direction, and would throw you off if you weren't standing in a puddle that was from like one of the dead tentacles that would grip you and keep you on the boss. And you needed to purposefully roll the boss in order to throw all these extra adds off the side of the boss, but everybody would need to be standing in a puddle while it happened, or else they would also get thrown off the boss. You could also manage this by, shifting from left to right repeatedly before the boss had time to roll. It would then start getting ready to roll the other way, and then, it's sort of like on Heroic and Normal Mugsy, where it was like whichever side had the majority, although unlike that one, you wanted to consistently keep it, changing which side had 51% of your raiders. But yeah, cool idea. cool idea. I will say the execution of this is something that I think left a lot to be desired. I don't think I'm going to put this one down in iconically bad, but I'm going to put it at the bottom of C tier. It's a historic mechanic. You know what? No, it's an iconically bad mechanic. It's an iconically bad mechanic, in my opinion. This is like super weird looking. Deathwing as an entire 2-boss fight was pretty underwhelming, and also this looked super janky, the way that the background would show that the boss was rolling by spinning the skybox and the boss doing it just didn't feel quite right. I know there were also people that had nausea issues on this fight as a result as well. Not to mention the other problems this fight had, but this is a one mechanic. We're only talking about one mechanic, not boss fights as a whole generally, although of course, it's hard for me to detach the sentiment that I have about boss fights as a whole from their most iconic mechanics. So I'm not really trying that hard to do that. All right, we move on to Mists of Pandaria, and we're going to start off with Will of the Emperor. One of the coolest mechanics, I think, was the Devastating Combo, which featured so basically this was another 2-boss fight. You have the 2 bosses, again, in the lineage of Twin Emperors, actually. And I guess these were Will of the Emperor, so even in the naming wise in the lineage of Twin Emperors. But yeah, so you'd have the 2 bosses, and they would do this combo, and it would be okay, there's a stomp as part of the combo, and if the boss stomped, you needed to get out of melee from it. And then there was left sweep and right sweep, and you needed to, when the boss would start doing that, you needed to dodge to the left or to the right of the boss without getting too far away from the boss. You couldn't just outrange the boss entirely. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but if you did, you wouldn't get the reward. And the reward was, if you successfully dodged all the strikes in the combo, you got to do a counterattack that did a bunch of damage to the boss, and was super sick, very satisfying reward. If you've been playing Expedition 33 and you know that feeling where it's Expedition 33 counters, that was what your raid would do on Will of the Emperor, is you did the Devastating Combo and then your raid group counters, bang, do huge damage back to the boss. Extremely satisfying thing to have happen on a boss fight. I will say this did spawn one of the most annoying achievements. That was eventually removed from the glory achievements here, but a friend of mine really wanted all the achievement points on this fight, so we went back in there years later to this boss fight and tried to make it work, and did, I think, eventually, after many failed attempts, where you needed to have your entire raid group successfully do this Devastating Combo, which was not easy, actually, to do. The other hard part was not accidentally killing the boss with modern gear, with one, tick of something that caused you to reflect damage outside killing the stupid thing. So, yeah, it was some fun Will of the Emperor prog in the year of our Lord 2022 that I've done, but I'm not going to let that take away from the boss's placement on this tier list. I'm going to put this mechanic up in A tier. I don't think it's quite turbo iconic, but I think the gameplay of this is extremely good. You know what? I think the gameplay of this is cool enough. I'm reversing myself. I'm throwing this thing up into the turbo iconic tier. The gameplay of this sort of thing, of dodging around and then the satisfaction of doing it right, brings it up into S tier for me. You can disagree with me. I'm sure this will be one of the ones that a lot of people do, but it's my tier list, as I've said 400 times in this video, and I can do whatever I want. Next boss is Garelon. Garelon featured a mechanic that was the successor to the feat mechanic from Lord Rylith, where the boss had legs that you needed to damage to basically control how the boss moved. A little bit different than the Rylith one, because it had 4 legs, I believe, instead of the 2 that Rylith did. And I think they also had a damage multiplier if you were in melee of one as well, so it wasn't just let's multi-dot all of them, although I think the damage multiplier was maybe not big enough that multi-dotting all of them was still really good. But yeah, cool mechanic. I think a little bit less iconic, because this was one that it transformed and it iterated on the Ryle of Feet mechanic, but I'm not sure that it evolved it in a way that justified, the being in the same or higher tier than the original. So I'll throw this one in the B tier. All right, up next is another mechanic that causes you to control something that's not you, which, again, my feelings about this are that there's some gameplay problems with this type of design. Not necessarily problems, just like, this can be a little annoying. But I thought the Reshape Life mechanic on Amber Shaper Unsock is actually one of the most innovative ways that this has been done. So you would control these monstrosities, but they were bad guys. You were controlling a bad guy, and you would use your willpower to make it do things that you needed to do. But I think the twist on this of it being like, hey, I'm controlling a bad guy, I guess it's sort of like the first boss of Blackwing Lair in that way, kind of similar to that, which didn't make this list. Maybe it should have. But I thought this is really cool. I'm gonna throw this one up in the B tier, joining kind of the original version of this style of mechanic in the Shadow of Death. Although, yeah, maybe I should have put the first boss of Blackwing Lair up in here as well. All right, up next is the Shaw of Fear boss fight, which the mechanic I've chosen here, okay, it's sort of the length of the fight. This is like a 20-minute boss fight. It also had a checkpoint. So when you reach the last phase, you got a haste buff, and that was important for doing the last phase. But if you then wiped, you kept the haste buff in phase 1 and 2, so you could get back to the last phase more reliably, which is an interesting mechanic. I do think that having a fight last this long, really anything over I would say anything over even like 8 minutes, except for an end of expansion boss, which can maybe be 50% longer, so maybe 12 minutes, has never been something I've liked. So bosses like Sylvanas and Razagath, where it's like, okay, we're entering intermission 2 before we go to phase 3. It's like, ooh, this is a long fight. Shaw of Fear was the long fight, so I'm going to put this in F tier. I think the length of this encounter was iconic about it. I will say the checkpoint part of it was kind of cool, although any boss that requires a checkpoint probably is an indication that it is too long of a fight. All right, we move into Throne of Thunder, another raid that sort of joins the pantheon with Ulduar and Naxxramas and Nighthold, where I'm recording this in front of. You can see a little slice of Nighthold up here where the background is where my character's currently parked. Of just sort of these iconic great raids in WoW's history as sort of understood by the population of hardcore high-end raiders, right? And yeah, Throne of Thunder, definitely one of these raids. Tortos is the first boss that I'm going to choose here, which featured a mechanic where there were turtles. The boss would spit out these turtle shells, and you would kick them back into the boss. Very weird. There's sort of some future versions of this mechanic that have sometimes been kind of weird or clunky or annoying, but I'm going to throw this one up into the A tier. I'm calling it. This is cool. Kicking the shells, sort of Mario-y. I don't know. This is neat. All right, up next we have Durumu. Now, Durumu had some sort of fiddly mechanics. So there's the light spectrum, the different colored eyes, and the maze. They're all kind of, hard to explain mechanics in a short time frame, especially for somebody who didn't raid prog this tier, which is me. But this is one of those bosses that was, I think, thought of very fondly by the super high-end player base as just like, wow, this is, a complicated, intricate mechanic that has been designed really well and is really cool. I'm going to throw this one up into the B tier of iconicness because, it's kind of two mechanics and there's not one thing that's super cool about this. It's just kind of like a very technocratic mechanic. All right, up next is Dark Animus. Now, this was another fight that was a huge hit among the people that really like using their brain cells in a raid encounter. Not so much in the LFR difficulty, which I believe had been out since Dragon Soul was when LFR was first implemented, although LFR had been going through some identity crises about how hard these different fights should be on LFR, whether it should actually be kind of tough and, wipe raids that don't understand them, or whether it should be a real walk-in, hit the boss for a bit, collect loot, hearth out type situation, or not even hearth out, but get teleported out. But the powered by Ana mechanic on Dark Animus was super cool. So basically, the boss had all these robots around the room, and at the start of the fight, you would like bust open this anima container, it would fill up some of the robots, and then as you killed robots, the anima would jump in to other robots nearby, and you would keep doing that. You keep killing these robots, but you could choose the order by killing these robots in different locations, and kind of build your boss fight in its own way based on how you wanted to move through the room, and kill off these different ads and get all of this anima into the eventually, I think, into the Dark Animus was what you were supposed to do, although I don't exactly remember how exactly it worked. I will admit, again, I didn't raid prog this tier. I think this is a super iconic mechanic, though. I'm debating between A tier and S tier. I'm going to put this one up in S tier. I think this is one of those mechanics where you look back and you're like, yeah, they were really cooking with this one. Oh, wow, another mechanic that has to go into S tier as well is Lei Shen, the Lightning Conduit. This is super cool. So I didn't even raid this tier, and looking at this, it's one of those fights where it's like, yeah, of people that progressed Lei Shen, the amount of them that have Lei Shen as their favorite boss of all time, even though Lei Shen is now closer to the game's launch than it is to modern, like to now, which is a crazy stat. That's like one of those things about Cleopatra and the pyramids and stuff. But yeah, this is a crazy mechanic where the boss had these 4 different lightning conduits around the room, and depending on the order that you charged them, you could completely change the texture of the fight and the mechanics it would do. But there wasn't an obvious answer. Oftentimes when they do this sort of thing, there's an obvious answer. But with Lei Shen, I think of the top few guilds that killed this boss, they chose different orders for this, and they were reasonable different ways to do this, which that was pretty common back here in the day. The convention had sort of developed that the world first kill video would be embargoed until 5 guilds in the world had killed the boss. Sometimes you'd get the leaks early. Sometimes there were guilds that wouldn't respect this as well as others. Sometimes you could find kill videos before then, but usually they would respect this, and all the guilds would wait to release their kill videos until 5 guilds had killed the boss, and then you'd see a boss like Lei Shen go down, and not only the 5 guilds that had killed it, but the next few guilds afterwards that had done significant progress before the videos came out all had different ways and different orders of doing the lightning conduits, which each controlled different mechanics on the boss. Incredibly cool, awesome design. I think one of the most inspired WoW boss fights that they've made for, especially for heroic rating at the time, which would soon become mythic rating. So now we move into Siege of Orgrimmar, which I believe, I'm not sure if it launched with Mythic Rating. Maybe Mythic Rating got added to this raid midway through the patch or something. I seem to remember that, but I'm not sure if it's 100% accurate. The mechanic I've chosen here for Siegecrafter Blackviews is the assembly line. So this is another one along the lines sort of the killing bosses determines the order of what's going to happen type thing, but it's a little bit different where you get sent up to this assembly line and the boss is constructing these different weapons, and you can kill one of them. But once you kill one of them, the other ones are going to get built. You couldn't kill more than one of them. And then you'd have to deal with the other weapons depending on what you chose. And again, different ways that you could do this. You could plan around which weapons you wanted to kill, how you wanted to do this. Even the process of getting on the assembly line and killing the weapons up there was cool. There were all these tubes around the room that you, like these pneumatic tubes you jump in to get sent around places. Yeah, this one's also going up in S tier. We're doing 3 S tier mechanics in a row. I'm trying not to power creep the tier list here, but I can't put this thing anywhere except for S tier. This is another one of those mechanics where you look at it and you're like, yeah, this is cool. This is it. All right, we're going to move into Warlords of Draenor. So there have been bosses. There was another heroic-only boss in Throne of Thunder. Ra-Den, actually, the first time we fought him, was a heroic-only limited attempts boss, I believe, after Lei Shen. But this was the first place where there's like a secret mythic boss, and it was actually a successfully kept secret. On Imperator Margok, Cho'Gall would spawn after you killed Imperator Margok on Mythic, and it was another boss fight at the end. Now, it wasn't that hard of a boss fight compared to Imperator Margok, but I believe there is or was footage of, I think it was Paragon at the time, killing Imperator Margok, doing all those nerd screams for getting world first, and then like, oh, wait, this isn't over yet. There is another boss that jumps out, and then you have to fight. Extremely cool, extremely iconic. This was repeated with Illidan in the Gul'dan encounter, which I chose a different mechanic from Gul'dan as my mechanic for that boss, but I think that was maybe even a better executed version of this. It was also extremely cool, but this is going in my S tier as well. Whatever, 4 S tier things in a row, a secret mythic boss. These days, it would be really hard to do one of these and have it actually be a secret, with just the amount of data mining that goes into raids these days from the top teams. But oh my goodness, it's so cool. Such a cool idea. All right, we move on to Blackhand. Oh man, I'm going to do 5 S tiers in a row. I can't avoid it. Blackhand just had such a sick mechanic with the boss crashing through the floor and bringing you deeper into Blackrock Foundry with, as the fight went on to the later phases. This is a mechanic they've sort of used again with bosses like Fallen Avatar, bosses like Sire Denathrius have had things that have been similar to this, but I don't think any of it do it as well as Blackhand did with, again, going through the floor. So cool. There were actually a decent amount of mechanics that I almost chose from Blackrock Foundry to make this list, but again, I didn't rate this expansion all that much, so some of them didn't get here, like the Orgorger Maze and the boat on Iron Maiden. So if you're a WoD fan, which I know a lot of raiders actually are, sorry for not including more stuff from here, but I hope you'll be sated by how high I'm going to tier several of these mechanics. Next mechanic is the iconic Weak Aura mechanic. One of the first big solved by Weak Aura mechanics was Wrought Chaos, and I believe Focused Chaos was the other one of this, on Archimonde. And the basic idea was you'd get a bunch of your raid that would get Wrought Chaos, and then a bunch of other players would get Focused Chaos, and each person with Wrought Chaos would shoot a beam at one of the people with Focused Chaos, and it would then jump to them, and then they would shoot at somebody else, and it would bounce around like that, but it would be your whole raid getting this at once. Now, there were a couple of different ways you could solve this in theory. You could make a circle, because what you needed to do is you needed to make sure that nobody else got hit by the line, because everybody's already getting hit by one line, and you wanted to make sure you didn't get hit by two, so you couldn't be in between any other pair of players with Wrought Chaos and Focused Chaos, and I think you couldn't even be in front of or behind them as well. So there are a couple different ways you could do this in theory. You could make 2 lines and have all the people with Wrought Chaos get on one line and all the people with Focused Chaos get on the other line. And that way it would always, crisscross. As long as you left enough space between each people in the line, you could never get hit by 2. Although it would be a little bit awkward to do with the people at the ends of the line. If you had somebody at one end get targeted by somebody at the other end, that would make a very shallow angle. So that would be something you need to be careful of. You could also do like a circle or an oval type thing, because a circle famously doesn't have any points on it, and famously every point in the circle, can see all the other points in the circle, and is not going to be in the lines of any other 2 points on the circle. So that would be another way to potentially handle this. But what turned out happened for most guilds, except for, I think it was Paragon that just YOLO'd it or had a system for it, but everybody else used a radar Weak Aura, because the Weak Aura could read your position, your buffs, and everybody else's buffs. That functionality has been neutered since then by Blizzard, so if they made a mechanic like this, it would not be solvable in the same way. But yeah, you just have a radar that showed you your line, everybody else's line, and like all your positions, and it would change green or red if you were standing in a spot where you were going to get hit by somebody else's line. So yeah, that was kind of a downside of this. I'm going to put this in historic tier. I haven't done a historic tier in a while, because I think that the fact that this was such a Weak Aura thing, that's part of a kind of bad pattern of Weak Aura mechanics ever since. But I don't think it was iconically bad. The mechanic itself is pretty cool. All right, we move into Legion. This was when I started Mythic raiding. So I had raided starting in TBC, starting in patch 2.1. I was like a 14-year-old with a MacBook trying to raid in the middle of the night without my parents knowing. I'm sure they actually knew that I was raiding. But yeah, I was raiding Karazhan and Gruul's Lair and stuff, and we would go into Serpent Shrine Cavern and kill the Lurker below, and we'd go into Tempest Keep and kill Void Reaver, and then we'd get out of there. And then I'd raided a little bit more in Wrath of the Lich King, did some heroic raiding, some like world, 500-ish or whatever, heroic raiding in ICC. And then, as I said, I dabbled a little bit in some Firelands and Siege of Orgrimmar raiding, but I didn't start seriously raiding until Legion. In Legion, when the day Legion came out, I was like, oh wow, this expansion looks sick. I want to play some World of Warcraft. I'm almost an adult now. I can do it. I can play a bunch of WoW. I don't really want to play that much Magic anymore, because I've been playing a lot of Magic the Gathering in college. But so I started playing WoW, and so since then, I have a lot more intimate knowledge of these different mechanics because pretty quickly, by farm of Emerald Nightmare, the first tier of Legion, I was in a cutting edge guild. And then by farm of Nighthold, I actually was in the guild that I'm currently in. We were US, 50th or something then, and now we're world 16th or something. So the guild has changed a lot since then. We used to be like a late night guild as well. Very different culture as well than it used to be, for the better as well. But the same guild with a few of the same players that have been there since back then. So anyways, Legion, I've got a more intimate knowledge of how exactly these mechanics worked for a hardcore player rather than the kind of, from the outside looking in and listening to Total Biscuit videos about these ICC mechanics and stuff. I played the ICC, but the old war mechanics and those kind of things. So let's do Xavius, I guess before Xavius as well, Cenarius. So Cenarius had roots that would chase you. And I believe this was like one of the original kind of private auras where I don't think you could have a weak aura tell you if you were being chased by nightmare brambles. I think that it was somewhat obfuscated. I'm not sure if there was some way you could tell with, I'm sure that if they did this mechanic now, somebody would have like, oh, there's actually an aggro table hidden in the files somewhere. I can make a weak aura for this. But I think at the time you actually couldn't tell. And you had to like notice that they were chasing after you and then not, grief with that mechanic. Interesting one. I would say a decently. I'm going to put this one in the C tier. I'm not too bothered by it. And then we have Xavius. So Xavius had the Dream Simulacrum, a cool idea. So basically, the entire Xavius fight, you're trying to not succumb to madness or get killed, but you could go into the Dream Simulacrum, and Ysera would send you into the Emerald Dream and make a simulacrum version of yourself. Your character would like fall asleep and then you'd be controlling the dream version of yourself. And if that character died or got full madness or whatever it was on that fight, you would just wake back up and it wouldn't, kill you. So you got a sort of second life. Now, unfortunately, this meant you could do like 2 Surrender to Madnesses on Xavius, which Surrender to Madness was already OP as hell, that tier, for Shadow Priest, but this fight in particular was super OP for Shadow Priest with Surrender to Madness, which at the time it was a void form that was super turbocharged, but when it ended, you died, right? And void form was just your insanity is going to drain faster and faster. So you needed to be doing your rotation super well to get as much as possible, to make it last as long as possible, to make it to your next Void Torrent, which when you made it to your next Void Torrent, that was kind of like a sigh of relief, a breath of fresh air. And if you were really sick, you could make like a 2-minute Surrender to Madness going. And there was like Vikland videos of him in front of some training dummies in Ashland, Ashran, getting a 10-year-long, Surrender to Madness going. But yeah, Xavius was a perfect fight for that. I mean, Xavius, the difficulty of this fight was not correctly tuned. It was super easy. The difficulty of the raid was not correctly tuned. It was super easy. Some of that was intentional. It being a first raid of the expansion, they used to make those relatively easy. Some of that was also they just underestimated how much M+ we were going to be farming in the first few weeks of that expansion. So I'm tempted to put this in F tier because Emerald Nightmare was bad, but the Dream Simulacrum mechanic itself was kind of cool, but it was also fatally flawed with how it empowered at Shadow Priests, and arguably this was the mechanic that trivialized this encounter because of that. I think I'm talking myself into putting it in the F tier. Also, it's going to help me avoid this tier list getting too big to fit on the screen if I make sure to put some stuff into the tiers that are less populated, so that's going to be my tiebreaker here. All right, we move into the Trial of Valor, one of my personal favorite raids, a mini raid as well, 3 bosses. There were definitely cool mechanics on Odin and Helya. Helya is probably one of my top few boss fights in terms of how much fun I had progressing that encounter. But I'm going to choose the Guardian's Breath mechanic as a representative from this raid, where Gwarm, a 3-headed dog, would breathe 3 different breaths, and there would be like a fire one and an ice one and a phlegmy, I don't know, necrotic one. I forget what the name is exactly of it. And on Mythic as well, you had all these extra interactions with which one to stand in. This was sort of a patchworky kind of fight, mostly about the DPS check. But this was sort of the iconic mechanic of it. And I thought it worked really well. I thought it was really cool. It looked beautiful. 3-headed dog, 3, flavored breath, sometimes simple, is exactly where it should be. I'm throwing this up in the A tier. All right, now we have Croesus, the legendary bridge boss of the Nighthold. So we're into the Nighthold, where my background, where my character's currently parked. Gosh, what a great raid this was. I've picked 4 mechanics from Nighthold, and there were many more that I was thinking about using. I mean, Trilliax, what a great, flavorful fight. Chronomatic Anomaly, a lot of cool stuff there. High Botanist, Talarn, super cool. Another one, I think, where you could do Death Order Mattering, and that was super fun. Spellblade Allurial, Tichondrius. I mean, yeah, every boss this raid was sick. But Croesus' slam was sick on another level. The boss would literally slam the bridge so hard that it would break the bridge. And the mechanics would get harder as the boss was pushing you deeper back in towards the Nighthold. And eventually there was only one bridge segment left, and the boss would slam that. And if that happened, you were toast. Wow, this is so cool. It was so fun. Playing with the encounter space, right? Destroying the terrain in a way similar, I guess, to the Black Hand fight. Yeah, this is going up in the S tier for me. Croesus slamming the bridges is so cool, so fun. Such a great way to make this fight work. All right, next we have Star Augur Atreus, which this boss had the marks. So this mechanic has been used a little bit since then. You could argue it's sort of a spiritual successor to the polarity shift, but this one, you would basically get players marked, and they would then need to find somebody the opposite mark or the same mark as them and clear with that person. And if you didn't do that, then it would be a wipe or the people would die or whatever. It was really bad. I forget exactly what happened. But this was super fun to execute. One of these mechanics where it's like, you just had to game. At a certain point, you just had to figure it out and react and move your character in a smart way. And it was one of those mechanics where you'd sort of move from being 20 raiders to being one raid team, and you would start learning how your friends played, and you would start, understanding like, oh, I've got this mark, the mage over there's got that mark, I know how he likes to play this, I know he's going to blink over here, I'm going to run and meet him there, right? And like, that was super fun. I'm going to throw this one up in the S tier as well. I have loved this mechanic and most of its successors. All right, up next is Elisand's time mechanic. So Elisand had an interesting mechanic where the later phases of the fight, the boss would basically reset and restart the fight, and then what you did in the previous phases would be, snapshotted. So 40 seconds into P2, the same thing that you did at 40 seconds into P1 would show up in P2, right? And then in P3 as well. Had a little bit of a weird gameplay side where if you could really fast push P1 and P2, P3 would be really easy at the end because it wouldn't be doing all this extra stuff that it'd otherwise be doing. So but on the other hand, that made farm easier, which I'm always a fan of farm being easier. I think farm's been too hard recently, to be quite honest with you. It also had other time mechanics as well, where there was like fasty zones and slowy zones, and you'd stand in the fasty zones to do stuff faster. And then the boss even dropped loot that was around this as well, with Convergence of Fates giving you cooldown reduction. Extremely powerful and iconic trinket from this boss. And there would be boss mechanics like projectiles that would bullet hell you, and you needed to dodge out of the way behind the slowy zone where they got slowed down, and then get back through to dodge them properly. Really cool fight. I'm going to put this one up in A tier because I don't think it's quite up in the S for me, but super strong mechanic for sure. Now Gul'dan. Gul'dan is up there for me in the fights I've had the most fun on playing. There was a lot of really cool stuff here, but I had a really hard time choosing an iconic mechanic from Gul'dan. And the one that I've chosen for this, I would say actually Gul'dan didn't really have, I think it had a better secret boss than... It had a really cool version of the secret boss with Illidan. He would like start doing his voice lines at 10% on Mythic Gul'dan, and if you didn't kill Gul'dan fast enough, you'd have Gul'dan and Illidan to deal with, which is super sick. And then just having an iconic lore character like that Gul'dan's like siphoning Illidan's soul, and then Illidan's, the shade of Illidan or whatever drops out on Mythic of that crystal. Super cool. That would go up in S tier by itself. But the mechanic I've chosen is the winds from this fight. And I'm also going to put it in S tier. If you look at what happened here, Gul'dan's he literally rips open the fabric of space-time behind you, and like the twisting nether opens up behind there and starts all the air starts vacuuming out of into that rift, and it starts blowing your raid towards it. Now, this has been used since then on other bosses like Razageth that have had winds stronger than the Gul'dan winds, but the Gul'dan winds at the time felt pretty darn strong. And I'm putting them in S tier mostly just because I can't put Gul'dan below S tier. Every mechanic I would have picked for Gul'dan was going to go in the S tier. I loved this fight so much. The flavor of it as well. Khadgar firing off his useless arcane missiles and going, "We can stop him, I know it," was also burned into my brain. But yeah, the winds were also super cool. I think underrated cool part of the Gul'dan fight, and of all the mechanics on this boss, I mean, it had a really cool tank mechanic as well. I didn't put a lot of tank mechanics on this list, even though I am a tank now. But the tank mechanic on this fight was kind of cool as well. The Fell Scythe, where you would like split the damage of it, but in order to trigger it, you had to run on top of the other tank, and if you didn't trigger it in time, the boss would just do it to your one main tank and just send them to the Shadow Realm. And also, if random DPS accidentally walked on your tank, then the boss would Fell Scythe them, and oops, they're all gone. Okay, we move in to the Tomb of Sargeras, and I've chosen here the Maiden's Infusion mechanics. So again, another spiritual successor to the polarities, actually. You can see a lot of these polarity shift mechanics successors have made it to this list. The boss would give you either a Fel infusion or a Light infusion, and this would have different mechanics, like the Fel tank and the Light tank would have different jobs, but also when the boss went into these intermissions, she would then start calling Fel and Light orbs from the other side of the room, and you'd have to split your raid up on these like lines, and then dodge in and grab the correct colored orbs as they were approaching you without accidentally grabbing the wrong color orb or colliding with one of the other players, I think, as well. It was bad on this mechanic too, so super cool mechanic, super beautiful look. The Fel Light combo, extremely awesome. I'm going to put this one up in the A tier. I don't think it's quite up here with the S tier ones, but extremely cool mechanic. Loved Maiden. Now we have Fallen Avatar of Sargeras. Now this is a boss fight that it was really hard. This is actually the last boss that I ever got benched on because I was kind of griefing on DPS warrior at the time. I would later become a rogue main. I would become a rogue main during Tomb of Sargeras farm, but I was a DPS warrior main up until then. So on progression of this tier, I was a DPS warrior main, and I died a couple times. In my heart of hearts, I still don't really think it was all my fault, but I don't know. I had a couple of bad pulls, and I ended up being benched on Fallen Avatar. So I have a visceral dislike of the boss for that reason. But it had a really cool mechanic where you could just trigger phase 2 by not soaking this beam, and the beam would just go into the boss, and the boss's energy bar would fill up, and then phase 2 would start. Normally, you wanted to do this when the boss is low health, so you could kill the boss, but if you wanted to progress phase 2, you could just practice phase 2. So what you could do is you could just practice all of phase 1, and then once you started making phase 2 pushes, you could just do phase 2 prog, and then once you'd done that, then you could put it together and actually try and kill the boss. This boss was infamously hard as well, generationally hard, especially for a non-end boss. Tomb of Sargeras was, I think, the most long-lasting Race to World First, even including Sepulchre, of the races between then and now. This was a generationally long raid in the modern era, and Fallen Avatar's difficulty, alongside Kil'jaeden's difficulty, was a huge part of this. But yeah, I'm going to put this one in... I think this is a cool design. I'm going to throw this in B tier. But definitely a cool idea here of letting you fight phase 2 ahead of schedule. All right, up next we have Kil'jaeden. Now in Kil'jaeden, this is a boss with several really cool mechanics associated with it. There's like a black hole that you have to make sure that you kite this fire puddle into so that it doesn't corrupt the floor. There was this pylon maze of eventually you'd have like 7 pylons, and you had to have somebody in your raid figure out in their head a safe spot that wasn't in line vertically or horizontally with any of those pylons. But the mechanic I've chosen here, I think the most mechanic of this, is Armageddon. So we talked about Twilight Onslaught on Warmaster Blackhorn being the first soak mechanic. I would say Armageddon is the ultimate. Not ultimate in terms of last, but ultimate in terms of like the most epitomizing version of a soak mechanic, where you just had Armageddon would spawn, and there would be one big Armageddon soak that ideally a tank would go in, although I think rogues with cheat death could maybe do it as well. And then like 8, maybe it was more than 8 as well. I think it maybe got nerfed down to 8 other Armageddon soaks that you needed to go into, and you would just run into those and try and soak as many. If you missed even one soak as well, it was a wipe. Which this was something that Blizzard has, back in the past there weren't as many of these mechanics where it's like 20 things happen, and if you miss even one of them, it wipes the raid. But since Armageddon, they've done them more and more often. Even though they've said they don't want to do them as much, they definitely have been still doing them way more than they used to. And they've even said in interviews like, "Hey, we don't want one person messing one thing up to wipe the raid." But if you look at like the Gallywix Mythic mechanic, if you ever touched a bomb and then you ever die, it wipes your whole raid. So they kind of made every mechanic on that boss into one person screwing up. It wipes the raid if it's one of the 5 people that's not allowed to screw up. So I don't know. It's had a complicated history, this style of mechanic, the punishing nature of messing up an Armageddon soak. I'm going to put this in historic. I don't think it's quite down and iconically bad because it is pretty fun to play. But I will say there's definitely a strong argument that this style of design has taken the game in a direction that hasn't been entirely positive. All right, up next we move to ENR. This boss was the tower defense boss. It was pretty easy for a Mythic boss in its spot. Like, if you could reach this boss, you could kill it reasonably quickly, even on Mythic, but it's been famously one of the hardest bosses, if you're Legacy rating and Taurus the Burning Throne, to be able to kill, and it was also famously pretty universally hated by players at the time. Not a particularly fun mechanic. Again, they were iterating. They were like, hey, what if we make a boss fight where you just defend the boss from, waves of attackers? And, I guess trying stuff is cool, but this one did not work out. It was a pretty iconically bad design for a fight. All right, up next, we move to Agrimar, which features Taslash Technique. This is Taslash's Agrimar's sword, and Taslash Technique was a tank combo. So it would do like tank slam and then group soak, and you would need to do the group soak on Mythic. You would need to do like 2 different groups, a group A and a group B, to do the group soak. If not enough people soaked it, it would just launch you all out of the boss room. And so your tanks would need to be taunting mid combo, spinning the boss around for the one that they need to spin the boss around for, while group A comes in, and then spin the boss back around the other way, or taunt to take the hit that's only supposed to be on them. Extremely intricate. This style of mechanic as well, where it's like, hey, the boss is going to cast 4 abilities in a row, and your tanks need to understand when they're supposed to taunt in the middle of it, has been done since on bosses like Shadhar. Bosses like Rashok have featured this sort of combo, and typically I think this is a pretty fun version of a tank mechanic. So yeah, I'm going to throw this one up in the A tier. Just the A tier. I don't think this is going quite into the S tier, but this is a pretty cool mechanic. Very cool boss fight as well. Up next, we have Argus, which featured the Sentence of Sargeras. So Argus had a lot of iconic mechanics, especially on Mythic. It had an entire Mythic phase that was super cool with the red sides and the red floor from the re-origination modules or whatever they were called. I think they might even be called exactly that, which is super cool. But the Sentence of Sargeras was, I think, the mechanic that, for me, is most memorable from this fight. And unfortunately, it's not for good reasons. So this was, after Tomb of Sargeras, people had immune-soaked way too many of the soaks on Fallen Avatar and Armageddon for them to be happy. So they made Sentence of Sargeras a mechanic where players would get chained, and they would need to run out and break the chains. And actually on Mythic, this was further complicated by Sargeras' fear, which some players would have, where they needed somebody to stay with them as they did that. And this was really a really punishing mechanic as well. You needed to stagger the breaking of these chains. It did a bunch of raid damage. And if you immuned while you had this, it didn't help. I think it either immediately broke it or it didn't do anything. Either way, it wasn't good. But you could pre-immune this. So this was the inception of the pre-immune strategy against mechanics. If you were immune when this went out, it wouldn't affect you and it wouldn't trigger the explosion. So what would happen is you would go into this fight and you would have, the first, I think if you timed it right, the first, second, and fourth one could all be AMS'd. And then otherwise, it was like the first and the fourth one could be Cloak of Shadows, and you could Divine Shield one of them as well. So you would stagger some immunities, and you would have these pulls on the boss where randomly it would only target your people that were pre-immuning, and you would just delete the mechanic from the fight, and it was way easier. Or randomly, everybody, the pre-immuned wouldn't get targeted, and you would just have to deal with it as intended, and usually you just wipe and go again and hope that at least a couple of people that were pre-immuning got targeted. So that worked out pretty poorly. I feel bad because Argus was a great fight, but this mechanic sucked. The pre-immuning paradigm was pretty awful. They came back and they nerfed the mechanic numerically while also making it not pre-immunable later down the line, and there was a big uproar about them buffing the boss, which they kind of also done on Mistress Sazine back in Tomb of Sargeras, where there was also a mechanic that you could immune that they were like, hey, actually, you shouldn't be able to immune that by having blood decays under the boss or whatever, so we're going to make that not work anymore. And then all of a sudden, guilds were reprogging that had already killed it and that kind of thing. So I don't think that really happened with Argus. I don't think a lot of guilds that had killed it struggled to re-kill it after this change. But there were definitely guilds that were progressing it that whined about it when it did get changed. And there's been a turbulent history of bosses that have gotten nerf/buffed. Zaskarn is another example of this, where very arguably it was easier before a change that was made to it when it had already been killed by a lot of guilds, and those are very awkward timings anytime there's something like that. All right, up next is Shadow of Zul. Now, Shadow of Zul had adds that didn't really have to die. You could just have a third tank kite him around, and it was all good. And you could use them for funnel. So if you had an Enhancement Shaman or some of these other little specs, or Subtlety Rogues, which was the best answer for this, your Subtlety Rogue could literally double their single target damage to Zul by having these adds kited within range for Shuriken Storm to hit them near the boss. I played Subtlety Rogue on Zul. Oh my god, it was so fun. Your rotation was super easy as well. Like if you've ever played a Bop It machine, right, where it's got like 5 different buttons on it, that was 3 more buttons than you needed to learn to play Subtlety Rogue on Zul. You needed Shuriken Storm and Eviscerate. You would start the fight, and I hadn't played Sub up until this point, so I quickly learned the opener, and then after that, Shuriken Storm, Eviscerate. Shuriken Storm, Eviscerate. You would just do that, and I was the only rogue main in my guild. This boss was so favorable for sub-rogues and doing this strategy, though, that it was worth it to, A, make all the other losers in your guild not hit the adds. You would tell your Athlock to not spec Phantom Singularity. You would tell your I-Beam idiots to spin around and not hit the adds, and something that they would learn for M+ that season as well on Shrine of the Storm first boss. I-Beam away from the ads so that my sub-rogue can keep funneling. But you really felt like the main character as a sub-rogue on this fight, and especially as the only main rogue alongside 6 alt-rogues, some of whom were extremely stupid, one of whom was wearing an intellect dagger to try and be less stupid, but it turns out doesn't help and actually has a lot less weapon damage on it than an agi dagger. And so I was just doing 50% more damage than anybody else in my raid. Oh my goodness, what a great time. There were problems with this. In fact, there were problems so severe that Sub-Rogue's funnel was destroyed in patch 8.1 and has never returned. But this is a biased tier list, and for me personally, as the only sub-rogue made on this boss fight, I'm going to place it in the S tier because it's some of the most fun I've ever had in World of Warcraft. All right, up next we have G'huun's orb running mechanic. So this was kind of cool conceptually, where there would be orbs that needed to get transported from these spawn points on the left and right to these deposit points in the middle of the room. And while you were carrying it, a laser was chasing you, and also you were getting progressively slowed, but you could throw the orb and somebody else could catch it. And this was kind of cool, and you had this little gauntlet to run. Unfortunately, in practice, the way that it worked out was you needed to set up specific groups to do each orb run, because you could only do it once per fight. And you needed to play 4 warlocks to set up 2 gateways per side, so you could actually get far enough to do this. In theory, you could have maybe gotten away with less if you put all the mobile people always running in a certain one, maybe it was possible, but almost everybody killed this with 4 warlocks, especially at the start, before this boss ended up, catching some nerfs, and so that was a pretty unfortunate way for this to turn out. I will say also, This made farm so frustrating on this boss. I had a decent amount of fun doing this fight on progression, but on farm, oh man, it was tough. If you had to slot anybody new in and they had to learn their orb run, or if you had to move around who was doing which orb run on farm. So I'm going to put this in F tier. I think especially the fact that it required 4 warlocks in a 20-person raid to do Cahoon is pretty damning for it. So it's going down here for me. All right, we move into the Battle of Dazar'alor, which featured King Mechatork, or High Tinker Mechatork, rather. And he had these spark bots. So it was pretty cool. These spark bots would be running around, and in order to deactivate them, you needed to get shrunk down by another boss mechanic. While you were shrunk down as well, your friends could trample over you and kill you, which was not good. It was a fun way to troll people. That definitely happened a lot in my guild. But so you'd get shrunk down, and then while you were shrunk down, you were small enough to hop inside these bots, and then you could see the symbols above other people's bots, but not your own. And so you had to communicate with them, the symbols, to input them into their bots. So you'd see red over somebody else's bot, and you'd tell them, oh, red, and then they'd press the button on their keyboard that corresponded to the red button on their vehicle bar. Extremely innovative. A little bit frustrating, like if you ever tried to do this outside of a voice group, if you ever played with colorblind players as well. They did have like screws and nails and stuff that you could refer to them as, but I did have a colorblind player in my raid at the time, and that was definitely something where it's like, okay, we've got to adapt to this. But the fact that they had at least visual language that was beyond just color helped with it as well. Odin had a runes mechanic as well, where we had, instead of calling them colors, we'd call them like fish and N or something based on what they looked like. But yeah, spark bots, this is a pretty cool mechanic. I don't think it goes up into the S or even the A tiers, but definitely pretty cool. I'm going to throw it in B tier. All right, up next, it's Lady Jaina Proudmoore. Iconic character. Couple of different cool mechanics on this boss fight. I would say just the general setting of this fight, where you're out in the open ocean. Jaina's lured you into open waters, as she lets you know when you pull her, and then she literally freezes some of the ocean for the later phases of the fight, where you go and chase her off of the boat. Super cool in that way. The freezing blood mechanic was a bit of a different one, though, where if you ever spent more than like 6 seconds away from other players, you would get frozen in an ice block, and there were other things as well that could freeze you on that fight. This was kind of a cool mechanic, a little bit fiddly to play with, very, very flavorful for the fight. I'm going to throw it into B tier as well. We move into Crucible of Storms, one of my favorite raids. This one featured the Relics of Power on Unat. All of Crucible of Storms actually had some cool through-line mechanics where there were a lot of kiss-curse things, where it's like, hey, this helps you, but it also hurts you. And also the items that Crucible of Storms dropped featured that as well. So Voidstone was an example of this, where Voidstone would give you a big shield, but that shield would also be a heal absorb. So if you pressed it and then your paladin lay on hands to you, it would get rid of the shield and also not heal you. Very bad if you ever had that happen to you. And then there was other ones as well. So the Voidstone was one of them, and there was a crown, and there was also a bubble thing, a trident, and they all had these different effects that would do nasty things to you, but also were important for solving the fight. And then the loot was also very flavorful as well to that. There was shared mechanics as well between Unat and the first boss of that raid, the Cabal, and that was super cool as well. But the Relics of Power were sick because not only were they vital for doing the fight, they also featured the Star Augur mechanic, where on Mythic you would get all of your raid would get attuned to one of the colors, either the blue storm, the also blue lightning, which you might sense that there was a little bit of a problem with readability on that one, and then the void color, which was at least easier to see. And you had to go and touch the appropriate relic within 15 seconds to dispel that effect from you. Otherwise, you died. And if you ran into somebody the opposite color as you, or of either of the two opposite colors as you, you also died. Extremely cool design. Another Star Augur clone. It was pretty cool as well because the 3 relics were being carried by players. So one of them was being carried by a tank, one of them was usually left on the ground and then was picked up briefly by Ellie Shamans to use, and the other was being carried by a mage. And so because of that, that actually informed the traffic rules that you would use for this, which is like, okay, the people that need to get to the tank have priority. They have right of way. And then it's the people who have the stormy one that have the second priority. And people who have the one that the mages touch, they actually don't need to necessarily move at all. They have lowest priority because the mage is blinking around and bringing the relic to them. So that was an extremely cool way that this mechanic got solved. The relics themselves were super cool. Using them was super cool. The fact that Ellie Shamans could use the Storm one for one tick, have it kill them to stop the downside of it, but get all the upside, and then Ankh without costing a battle res was a little bit of a, something that maybe shouldn't have worked for that, but we ended up not using any B-reses on our kill anyways, so it didn't matter. We could have B-resed it. The Onks didn't matter on our kill anyways. So yeah, Relics of Power, I don't know, this was super cool. It was one of those, again, mechanics where it's super designed. You might read it and think it's over-designed, but it was super fun to play. And for me, that combination is always going to be at least A tier. This one's jumping up to S tier for me because Unat's just one of my favorite bosses. All right, we move on to Queen Azshara. Now, Queen Azshara had very awkward line of sight mechanics, as I've already mentioned in the later phases. It had a sort of similar mechanic to the Velastra's Burning Adrenaline as well at the end of the fight. But I'm going to talk about Queen's Decree, which was really cool. So this was in the intermissions. I hated this fight, by the way, but the Queen's Decree was cool. So you would get given a combination of orders from the Queen, and they would be like, hey, stand on top of a friend and, keep moving, right? Or you would get another one that's like, hey, don't stand on top of a friend and don't move. And I think there were 3 different criteria. Maybe it was just those 2. I think it was 3 though. And you'd get different combinations of them. And you had to strategize like, okay, everybody who gets, move and don't stack obviously just runs around the edges of the room and you stay away from them. Everybody who gets move and stack moves to this world marker and is running around. And you'd have these different ways of solving it, but it was pretty cool. It was a pretty cool idea. Unfortunately, it got reasonably weak aura'd where it's like, okay, you just have a weak aura pop up that's like, hey, move to square, keep moving or whatever. And that would be how it would solve. So to me, that's going to knock it just down to C tier, but still a cool mechanic. And honestly, Queen Azshara's mechanic landing in the C tier here, there was a lot of Queen Azshara mechanics I could have chosen that would have been F tier. Arcane Vulnerability, F tier. Absolutely. P1 of that fight, F tier. Definitely goes down there. P2, F tier. P3, C tier. All right, we move into Ny'alotha, the Waking City, where we have the Prophet Skitra's Images mechanic. So this is a pretty cool mechanic on Mythic. On Mythic, you'd have half your raid would get like one hallucination, and the other half would get the other one. And each team, the boss would split into images, and it would split into 4 images. But only one of them was real. And the way you could tell which one was real was the 4 images would be a different 4 images than the other team would see. So there were like a bunch of different positions around the room, and you'd maybe see the boss in positions 1, 3, 4, and 7. And then the other group people with the other delusion would see the bosses in positions 2, 4, 6, and 8. And they were both groups would see the boss in position 4, and you had to figure out like, okay, we can both see this one. That's the real one. Let's kill that one. Now, the way that you actually would solve this is the tanks would always have opposite polarities or whatever as each other. So you would just have the 2 tanks figure out which one they could both see. Usually one tank, that was me, would drop 4 world markers on the 4 images you could see, and then the other tank would call out which one was actually on an image that they could see, and then you would all go and kill that one. But still, it was a cool idea. Very cool idea. The execution, maybe kind of mid. So let's put it in the mid dull of our tier list here in the B tier. All right, up next is Obsidian Skin. So this was Mott, the 3rd boss of Ny'alotha. And Mott would cast Obsidian Skin, would put up a big shield, and you would just try and do big damage into this because it would reflect 100% damage back at you while it was doing this. And you would try and just one-shot yourself through the Obsidian Skin. It was super fun. You would try and proc an infinite stars with 10 stacks on this boss and just instantly die, or throw a huge star surge into the boss, do a full combust into the boss, and just be taking, most of your health bar per tick. Your healers would be having a blast trying to keep everybody alive. They'd be throwing a pain suppression on the person to try and stop them from dying. Super fun to do. Super iconic ability for me going into A tier. All right, up next is Xanesh, the 4th boss of Ny'alotha. A lot of iconic abilities here in Ny'alotha. Xanesh is going in 4th. This is the soccer boss, where you needed to kick a ball from a spawn point to an end point. There were a bunch of different times this would spawn throughout the fight, a bunch of like obstacles, although there would be preset locations that you could usually stand, and you'd get a weak aura that put guidelines on your screen during this. But yeah, it's actually called, some people call it the football mechanic, but World First this tier was earned by North American Guild, so it was named officially the soccer mechanic, and I think it was pretty fun. It was another one of those ones where it was very fiddly. During farm, if you ever had to swap out somebody who had one of these kicks, it was pretty awful. So I'm just going to throw it in the C tier. But yeah, definitely a historic mechanic for sure. All right, up next is Cursed Blood. Cursed Blood was a super interesting mechanic on Il'gynoth. Actually, the second time Il'gynoth was a boss at the end of Ny'alotha, not the Il'gynoth in Emerald Nightmare, which had some iconic mechanics of its own. Man, as I'm doing this tier list, I could easily make another 100 iconic abilities to go in another one of this, but the Cursed Blood mechanic, unfortunately, was fatally flawed. It had this really cool design where the circles would grow and shrink, and I think depending on what size you dispelled it at, it would do more or less damage as well. And it was really interesting to think about how you would do it, and then if you died with it as well, it would do its damage to the whole raid, which was really bad. Unfortunately, it had one fatal flaw, which is you could just never dispel, ever. And then if somebody died, your entire raid would go boom. But if nobody died, the fight was a lot easier than actually figuring out how to dispel this stupid thing. So unfortunately, this one's going to have to go into iconically bad here. It's a fatal flaw of an otherwise good mechanic. But yeah, that's where it's going to have to go. All right, up next is Corrupted Existence. Now, your healers that had done so much work to keep you alive on Mott against the Obsidian Skin would get to change into evil villains and kill you on Ra-Den. Actually, the second time we fought Ra-Den here in Ny'alotha. So Corrupted Existence would be a dot, but if you ever got topped to full health while you had Corrupted Existence on you, you would die. And there were healers in my guild, especially a Holy Paladin, that loved to holy shock you and kill you when you had this stupid mechanic on you. But definitely, it was funny. It was all really funny when it happened. Another cool mechanic, definitely one that I can't ignore, so we'll throw it into B tier. All right, up next we have N'Zoth himself, or itself, that featured the Sanity mechanic. On Mythic, you had Sanity as well that you needed to restore by using your Heart of Azeroth. Every single person in the raid could use their Heart of Azeroth once to restore Sanity in a circle around them. Although on Mythic, you also had to use some of your Hearts of Azeroth to defuse bombs in the super epic secret Mythic phase that was neither super epic nor really all that secret. It was pretty secret. It was pretty unknown exactly how it would work, even though this was at the time in the Race to World First where there was a bit more data mining, but not as much as we have today. There was definitely some understanding of what might happen in that room, although not fully understood. This was actually the first Race to World First that I ever casted as well, was Ny'alotha, the Waking City. So the first time I was there for Race to World First, the first World First boss kill I got to witness was N'Zoth, and it was probably the loudest one as well, because this was the first World First that North America, Complexity Limit at the time, now Liquid, the same guild, got this World First. Yeah, 8 years since North America had a World First, and all of the BFA expansion featured them getting so close and then choking on N'Zoth, getting owned with a hotfix timing and nerf timing on Ajara, getting sort of owned by more on Jaina. And yeah, then this boss, finally they're able to prove everybody wrong. And I remember the room shaking as they realize they're going to start killing her. The boss, finally goes down and everybody's yelling. And I was, 30, 40 feet away in the caster desk for this, but it was, it's something that absolutely completely unforgettable here. So that was an unforgettable experience. This was an unforgettable boss for me personally as well. This was the first time my guild did, I think, World Top 50. We got World 36th, I believe, on this boss, and it was on a kind of out of nowhere pull where I think our best was like 20%, and then we just randomly killed the boss out of nowhere with less than a fifth of a second before we were all going to get mind controlled at the end of this fight, because this fight, the sanity mechanic, when you lost all your sanity, you got a damage buff, but then you would get mind controlled at the end of it, and the way you did the end of the fight was you purposefully got everybody MC'd for the last 20 seconds to all just burn the boss together and try and kill it. I'm talking myself into S tier for this mechanic. I'm going to do it. I originally was going to put this mechanic kind of low, because I think mechanically this fight was somewhat underwhelming, but the sanity was cool. and I can't put N'Zoth anywhere except for S tier, just based on personal memory of how well the Race to World First went that tier and how well the tier went for my guild. All right, we move into the Shadowlands expansion. We are into the same decade as this video is being recorded now. We start off with Shriekwing, which featured the lantern mechanic, kind of an interesting one on Mythic. You had this lantern, and if you were holding the lantern or within a radius around it, you could see the echoing projectiles that otherwise were invisible. And then during the fight, you needed to protect the lantern from the boss as well. If the boss ever jumped on the lantern when it was hunting around in the intermission phase, it would be all over. It would like break and wipe you. Kind of a cool design. The intermission was kind of cool as well. I'm going to throw this in C tier, though. Yeah. The intermission, it was kind of annoying because I don't think you could damage the boss during the intermission. So even though it was kind of fun to do this lantern dance and you wanted to avoid standing in the lantern for too long, because if you stood in the lantern, you got a debuff that let you see the projectiles. But also if you stayed in the lantern's field, you would start getting a stacking dot. So you needed to just like tap the lantern for a second and then get out of it. So that led to, it was kind of fun to do, but also kind of frustrating, kind of counterintuitive, a little bit fiddly, especially for a first boss. I remember PTR testing Shriekwing and being like, wow, this could be, a 6th boss in a raid. And then they ended up tuning it way down from the PTR version for the live version, of course, because it was the first boss. But yeah, maybe it shouldn't have been a first boss. Maybe this mechanic, I'd be thinking more fondly of it if it wasn't. All right, up next we have Artificer Zymox's Portals, which Artificer Zymox was 2 different portal bosses in Shadowlands. It also showed up in Sepulchre of the first ones. The portals on the Castle Nathria version were definitely interesting, though, where you would have to use them to like deposit. You'd take these seeds into these portals and throw them onto the other side of the room by doing that. And then also the boss would be gripping you towards this big old sword in the middle of the room, and you needed to take the portal to get away from that. And then also there would be spirits that were chasing you, trying to MC you, and you needed to dodge them with the portals. It was actually a pretty interesting mechanic. I think pretty iconic for the boss. So iconic that the exact same boss had a portal mechanic 2 raids later, that expansion, which is pretty funny. I'm going to throw it in the B tier. I didn't really like the fight overall, but the portals were cool and pretty iconic. All right, up next we have Gluttonous Miasma, the Hungering Devourer mythic mechanic, which was like this heal absorb that you would be unable to take healing, but you could stand on top of other people and siphon health from them. But if you did this, they would get a stacking buff that made it, or stacking debuff that made them take more damage from it. And then it would jump to them, I think, or it would jump to random people maybe at the end of it. I think it maybe jumped to the closest person when the debuff expired. And then they would start, turning into this sort of vampire. Interesting mechanic. I actually think Unot had a similar mechanic to this as well in the last phase, where that was how you needed to heal up. Kind of cool. I don't think it was especially iconic. I think more just a historic one. So we'll put this one in C tier. Definitely nothing bad about it, but along this list of other mechanics, it maybe is one of the ones that less deserves a spot here on this list and should be lower on it. Sludge Fist is up next. One of my favorite boss fights of all time. Again, a spiritual successor, the 2020s version of the 2000s boss fight that was Patchwork. The boss had a huge DPS check, a huge healing check. This was back when healing was not about surviving one-shots, but it was about triaging and healing, throughput, and also making sure the people that were taking the huge damage were covered and were being saved. Very cool fight to tank, very cool fight to DPS, very cool fight to heal. Also featured a super sick enrage. So the mythic mechanic, you were chained to people, and if you ever got too far from them, you would snap the chain and both get stunned and take huge damage, and that was awful. So you always had a partner that you needed to stay with, and it was really close, actually. It was like 15 yards. It later got nerfed. This boss got hugely nerfed over its time as a progression boss for later guilds, but the pre-nerf version of this boss fight was so brutal, and every single guild that I know of in the top few hundred killed Sludgefist the same way, which is you've been struggling against this boss. You've seen it reach the enrage at 15% health, and you're like, how the hell are we ever going to find the damage to kill this? And then a pull happens, and you play so well, and the boss charges at the end of the fight, because the boss would charge into 4 pillars throughout the room, and that would be a mechanic of the fight. And then the 5th charge, you don't have many pillars left, So the boss just charges into a wall, and when it hits the wall, it starts doing huge ticking raid damage because the whole building is collapsing on you while that's happening, and you're going to die after a few seconds, except the tanks can maybe live for like 10 seconds on this fight. And so the boss charges into the wall, and not every guild, but most guilds I know of have the same experience of the boss charges into the wall. You have like 16 players still alive because you've had a pretty good pull and you've been doing great damage to the boss, and you're standing in a barrier and in a link, and your final few spells are flying at the boss, and 10 more people die and a couple people are immune, and your tanks, one of them is alive and one of them is dead, and you barely squeeze out the damage and the boss goes down, and you're like almost universally one of the most satisfying boss kills ever. Yeah, that one's going right up into the S tier for me. All right, we move on to the Council of Blood. Now, Council of Blood featured a mechanic called so there were two different dances on this boss. There was this kind of janky intermission that actually changed several times on PTR. It was originally a vehicle intermission, if you'll believe it, where you got a vehicle bar and you had to shimmy left or sashay right or whatever, boogie down, prance forward, depending on and they were just buttons on your extra action bar. The version that eventually went live was you went to your square and then you had to move to the appropriate squares based on what the boss told you to do. That's not the mechanic I'm talking about, though. I want to talk about Dark Recital, which was you'd get the boss would start shooting at you and you'd be linked to a partner that you needed to stay close to while also dodging all the projectiles that the boss was shooting at you. Really interesting one to solve in theory. Although it ended up being that you would just have everybody stack behind the boss, and then everybody who got Dark Recital would all move together, and that way you'd be moving with your partner, and you just move in a circle around the boss to keep melee uptime. So it got solved in a little bit less of a fun way than it maybe could have if you couldn't be near other partners, although then it would be really hard. But yeah, cool mechanic, cool fight. We'll throw it into Historic. All right, up next we have Stone Legion Generals. Now, Stone Legion Generals had a lot of mechanics to talk about. There was a healing reduction that you could get when you'd push the gargoyles below 30% health, and then your entire raid would be taking 80% reduced healing, which was super fun to deal with. There was Wicked Glaive, which the boss would throw at you, and if you pulled this boss in the first 3 months of its existence, that Wicked Glaive, you didn't know where it was going to go. It could go around you for 10 seconds before actually hitting you and doing damage. There was General Draven, your friend, in theory, who would be flying up in the air and would be punching down these mobs that needed to get punched down so you could gather them up. And he would punch them down at 30% health, and then he'd group them up, and you'd need to kill them at specific times in specific locations, except General Draven would fly to them in random orders, and sometimes he'd be super slow, and sometimes he would crit them and just one-shot them in the air, and sometimes he would miss them, and then they would drop down at full health. And that was super fun, exciting RNG to deal with. And then there was also General Call, who would do a bleed, and you could have a Voidwalker take this bleed, so your tank in the intermissions could pull this boss super far away from your group, and then just leap away every time the boss did this tank bleed, and then it would recast and kill your Voidwalker instead. And then your Warlock, who was already having a really fun time casting Curse of Weakness on CD, would also get to cast Resummon Voidwalker on CD, which was super fun. They had a lot of fun with that. And then your Priest as well would have a great time on this fight too, because they would mass dispel, and they would mass dispel this heart bleed on people. It was like a 30-second medium intensity dot, and they would mass dispel it, and then it would apply 4 stacks of a totally lethal dot to them, and then kill them. And that was super fun for them to deal with as well. And then they would go angel form, and then they would take the Ankh Totem, or they would have the self-res thing out of the angel, maybe that expansion, or maybe it was just the Ankh Totem. And that was super, super fun and exciting. So yeah, Stone Legion Generals was super great. And the best part of it was there was phase 1 where you fought a general and a Goliath. And then there was phase 2 where you fought a different general and a Goliath. And then there was phase 3 where you fought the 2 generals together. But the Goliaths were harder than the generals. So phase 1 and phase 2 were much harder than phase 3, where the actual 2 bosses were. And that was by far the easiest phase of the whole fight. And yeah, this was the worst boss fight ever made. It was so annoying. It was so stupid. They nerfed it, but never really made it fun. And I hated it so much. I hated my time fighting this boss. The fact that phase 3 was so easy as well meant that you were just having these pulls, even 300 pulls into progression on this stupid fight. You were just wiping in P1 and P2 over and over again. And then, it's our 3rd time seeing phase 3. And now the boss goes down. And you didn't even feel anything. You just felt empty. You felt relieved that the boss was dead, but also empty inside. And then you felt, even though you were starting prog on Sire Denathrius, there was this dread inside you because you knew we're going to have to re-clear Stone Legion Generals. And you did have to re-clear it. And then Fated Season came out and you got to do Stone Legion Generals again. All right, next boss is Sire Denathrius. So Sire Denathrius was a very good palate cleanser after the atrocity that was Stone Legion Generals. The mechanics I've chosen for this, again, I picked two because they're just both so iconic. Some of these, when I made two, Frank made two different images for me, and some of them I made them into one image. I think it's based on whether I put an and symbol or some slashes in the list I sent him. Shout out Frank. Thanks so much again for making this tier maker for me. But yeah, Massacre and Inversion were two core mechanics to Sire Denathrius. Massacre was Sire Denathrius' sword, Remornia. A big projection of it would make all these slices on the ground, and you would have to dodge out of the way of them, but it was really hard to do. It was really fast-paced, and there would be like 20 of these stupid things that you had to try and figure out how to dodge. So that was super fun. And then the mythic mechanic in the last phase was super innovative on this fight as well, where half of your raid would run through this mirror, and then they would get phased from the rest of your raids, sort of. But if you ever walked on top of somebody in the opposite phase, bang, you'd both die. So you would need to have two groups, the upstairs group and the inverted group. And then the boss and mechanics would interact with you differently based on if you were upstairs or downstairs. If you were upstairs, you would get knocked away when the boss hit you with one of his abilities. If you were downstairs, you'd get knocked towards the boss. So that was super fun to figure out and to learn and how to deal with. And you had to do this complicated dance around the boss because you had to soak these orbs that were created by the people in the other realm. So you'd constantly be rotating around the boss. Super cool fight. Very, very cinematic. Beautiful looking. Massacre was a great dodge mechanic. Inversion in the last phase was a great, creative mechanic. Very cool fight. Also, I believe the last boss fight to ever feature World First and World Second using different strategies. There have been minor differences, especially on earlier bosses. Since then, you could look at like Nexus Princess Kaiveza, where Liquid and Echo use different strategies for how you charge the clones and stuff. But this was the last boss fight where fundamentally P2 is done entirely differently by Echo and Liquid because both guilds went dark for a little bit on progression here during phase 2 progression because it was the end of the first reset. And so that's the kind of the perfect time to do some pulls off stream. And then when they came back, they both had very different ways of solving that fight. So super cool from that perspective as well. All right, we move on to the Sanctum of Domination with Anima Powers. This was the Terragru. Anima Powers were a Torghast mechanic. Torghast was kind of universally disliked among high-end raiders, but the Terragru itself was super fun. So you did have to clear a bunch of trash to do this, which was the downside. But then you got 4 Anima Powers on every person in the raid, and some of them were pretty OP. And this boss fight, you just let you get super OP against it. It was not a hard boss fight, and so it wasn't supposed to be. They didn't try and make it so hard that you needed optimal anima powers or anything like that. But if you got good anima powers, you could super blast on the boss. If you didn't, you could reset them, which was kind of stupid. And people doing that before raid was kind of annoying or whatever, but that's all good. You could clear trash 15 minutes before raid and then re-roll your anima powers, which at least it was an incentive for people to show up early and clear trash. So that was kind of nice. Yeah, this was really cool and fun. I'm going to put this up in A tier. I think that as far as first boss mechanics go, this is the kind of thing I like to see where it's just like, yeah, this fight's not going to be hard. This mechanic is not going to have a high degree of competitive integrity or whatever, but it's cool, it's fun, and it's on a first boss, so it doesn't matter, right? Like, could you imagine if there was something like this on a last boss that was super tightly tuned? It would kind of suck, right? Because you're like, okay, now we have to get the best one so we can actually kill the super hard boss. But Terragru, not at all like that. Perfect place to use this. All right, up next is Painsmith's Spikes. The spikes on this boss were this entire boss fight was super technical, super intensive. The spikes happened throughout the main phases, but they especially happened in the intermission where spikes would be chasing you down, and you then needed to dodge them, and you were dodging them while the middle set of them didn't have an opening. So you'd have these spike sets that had openings in them, and you would have to find your way to the open spot as the column was coming at you, while there were also death balls rolling at you from the sides that you had to dodge. And then the middle set just didn't have an opening. So you had to like blink over it, or you could gateway. I don't think you could gateway over it actually either. You gatewayed at the end of that phase to get to the front of the boss. Maybe you could gateway that one if you actually needed to, but you'd blink over it, or you'd have some other tool like that. But there were some classes that couldn't do that. Like Death Knights, I think, would just Icebound Fortitude and Necrolord it. Shamans could Necrolord it, or they could like jump off and Goblin Racial back on, which I think was also what priests had to do against it, was learn how to jump off and Goblin Racial back on, which is kind of cringe, but it was super fun fight, super cool mechanically all throughout. We're going to throw this up in A tier as well. All right, now we are on to Fatescribe Rokalo. Now, Fatescribe Rokalo had a floor full of runes, and in the intermission phases, these runes would light up. And while you could run on top of a rune to cause it to move in one direction, or you could put two people on it to cause it to move in the other direction. And while it was moving, a line would connect it to the middle of the room. Now, you could jump over this line, but if it touched you, it would put a huge dot on you. So in theory, you had all these different runes from the middle rings to the outside rings of the room. And you would need to figure out, like, okay, we need to get this rune 15 degrees to the left. We need to get this rune 180 degrees around the room. We need to get this rune 90 degrees to the right. How are we going to solve this? These people are going to cross over each other. So maybe the outside rune has to step off for a second so that the people on the inside rune don't get sliced by the laser, or maybe they just have to jump over it as they're passing. And then it turned out that there was just enough time in the intermission that if you all got to your runes right away, you could just always have them always move left, and you would never have to jump over anybody else's lines. And the mechanic was not a thing as a result. So yeah, we're gonna throw that in the F tier. A little oopsie from old Blizzard on that one. Okay, then we have Kel'Thuzad, which featured another mechanic with an oopsie. Kel'Thuzad itself was a fight full of oopsies with stopping damage, but Soul Fracture, especially in the first week, was a huge oopsie because you could... So this was a tank mechanic where your tank would get 5 fragments of their soul fractured out of them, and you had to kill those fragments to return them to the tank so that they could then taunt the boss and not get one-shot by it, which was interesting. But if the tank died, the soul fragments died as well, and the cheat death trinket that dropped from Fatescribe wasn't actually a cheat death trinket. It was a trinket that gave you a free self-res when you died. So, for the first week on Kel'Thuzad, you could just have your tanks take this mechanic and then die. And in fact, you could have DPS players with taunts take this mechanic and then die and then use the trinket and completely trivialize it. Another little oopsie. They did end up patching that one, but the fight as a whole was pretty awful. So another one I'm pretty comfortable putting into F tier. All right, up next is Sylvanas' Chains. This fight had a few different types of chains, and actually a few really cool mechanics in Phase 3, but the chains mechanic was the first intermission. So after Phase 1, the boss would throw 20 chains onto the Citadel, or maybe it was 19 chains. I think maybe somebody didn't get chained. 20 chains onto the Citadel, and they would all attach to somebody and start gripping them towards them. And if that person ever hit their chain, which I think gripped with increasing intensity over time, then they would get killed. And so you'd have to be running away from your chains and killing other chains, and melee they would spawn in clusters, so you could AoE some down. And then it turned out you could have Moonkin. Moonkin is just Starfall and carry that phase. So if you played enough Moonkins, they would handle that for you, which is a little bit of a fatal flaw for it. We'll throw this one in C tier though. This one wasn't quite bad enough to land into the F tier for me. All right, up next are Halandris bombs. So Halandris would have these bombs, 3 at the start of the fight, and another 3 when you made it to Phase 2. If these bombs ever got hit by a boss mechanic, they would explode and wipe your raid. That was eventually nerfed. That became no longer true, but for a while that was true, where any mechanic, the tank beam, anything else hitting them, it's over. If these bombs stood on the floor unattended for 10 seconds, bang, they would explode and wipe your raid, and it was over. If these bombs, you tried to pick one up, and you'd picked one up in the past, 30 seconds, you couldn't pick one up, or 20 seconds or something like that. You couldn't pick one up, so you'd walk over it, nothing would happen. If this bomb was held by a player for 10 seconds, it would explode and wipe your raid. So, Eventually, a lot of that was nerfed, and you could pick the bombs up sooner, and it was like a 30-second timer. But during progression on this boss, you had to have 6 pairs of 2 players that would each babysit a bomb with each other, understanding how to perfectly drop it, leave it on the ground just until the timer was about up, and then the next person would pick it up, keep it until it was just about to explode, and then drop it. You would have to follow the boss along these corridors, and during these corridors, you would have these spots where you'd learn, like, okay, here's where I drop my bomb. Every single bomb group would have a different world marker macro that they would use to indicate which bomb they drop. Because there's 6 bombs, they all look the same. You see a bomb on the ground, you don't know if it's yours, if your partner dropped it or not. This was before pings existed as well. So you'd have like 2 people would share the triangle marker, and they would put the triangle marker whenever they dropped the bomb, and that way the other person would know where it was going to be. Super intricate, super difficult to do. Oh my goodness, it was so frustrating because if one person messed this up, it wiped your raid. But let me tell you, when you killed this boss with this version of this mechanic, it was you were like, wow, we are sick at this game. There are not a lot of people in the world that can execute a fight of this difficulty. So this is turbo iconic mechanic for me. They've reused it a little bit. The Fire Axe Seeds shared some similarities to this, slightly different vector of difficulty on that mechanic, but a similar idea. This one's going in S tier for me for sure, though. All right, up next is Anduin's Blasphemy mechanic. This is another one that's sort of similar to the way that the Relics of Power on Unot worked with moving the... and also with the polarities and stuff, the Star Augur marks. So Anduin would only actually do a really hard blasphemy once at the start of the fight, and then for the rest of the fight, whenever he cast it, half your raid would be downstairs, and it'd be a lot easier. There was a last phase version of this mechanic as well that was also a lot easier to deal with. But the first cast of this mechanic was actually super hard. So your raid would all get either a shadow mark or a light mark. And you would have to, I think, touch somebody with the opposite mark as you to clear it. But if you touch somebody with the same mark as you, it's a wipe. And, until they nerfed it, if you touch somebody with no mark, bang, it was a wipe, which was unprecedented. That didn't work that way on any of the other versions of this mechanic up to this point. Didn't work that way on Heroic. But on Mythic, until they nerfed that, it worked like that. And until they nerfed it, I think you had 8 seconds pre-nerf to do this, and then it was 12, and then it was 16. Anduin, I think the most nerfed boss in history, Mythic Anduin. If you look, there's a Wowhead post with all the accumulative history of Sepulchre's nerfs, and it's many, many pages long, but Anduin's is the biggest block of text. What a brutal encounter. But the blasphemy mechanic was so cool because you could solve it programmatically. Echo actually did solve this pretty programmatically. They would have everybody split spreads to preset locations, and then they would have a weak aura pop up, and it was calculated to move you. It would indicate who you were supposed to move to and who was supposed to move where, and it would solve it that way. But Liquid and then most other guilds afterwards, because we didn't have a weak aura like that to set up, solved this instead by gaming it. And gaming this mechanic was super fun. You would, obviously, if you had somebody near you, you would have you'd spread to a similar spot every time. In some cases, some guilds would do exact spots. And then you would have a first priority person. And of your 20 people in the raid, maybe 10 of them get to just pair off, and the person nearest to them is the opposite color as them, and they can just clear. And then as soon as you cleared, you needed to get out of the way. So the places to get out of the way were either under the boss in the middle of the room or at the very edges of the room. And then a sort of donut ring was left as the highway for people to move so that they could find somebody else to clear with that was the opposite color as them, and then they could move to the edge or move to the middle of the room. It was so beautiful when you watched it work for the first time after wiping for your first 20 pulls or whatever to doing this wrong. And then you did it and you're like, oh my God, we've done it. And it's one of those mechanics where it was so fun to play every time, solving the blasphemy, and you got super good at it by the end. But yeah, this was super iconic. I'm throwing this up into S tier. This is a great mechanic. All right, up next is Rygalon. Rygalon was a great fight. A lot of cool mechanics on this one as well. The thing I'm going to go with, though, is Big Boom. The Big Bang, I think, was actually the spell that it's casting here. The end of the Rygalon fight on Mythic. So on the lower difficulties, it just does a cast and wipes you. Sort of like Mugsy. On Heroic, Mugsy just does, 2-second cast and kills you. But on Mythic, it was a 30-second cast at the end of this fight. You made it through the fight. Super tough to execute. Intense HPS check. Boss still has 7% health. and you're like, oh my god, we're never going to beat this DPS check. You're like, we've wiped. And then the first time that a Race World first killed, I think it was Echo, saw this Enrage first, maybe it was Liquid. The boss starts this Enrage cast, and you're like, oh, it's a 30-second cast. Oh, we can have the damage if we get to this point. Actually, before the second Legendary came out, so in the second week, which only Liquid and Echo killed this boss in the second week, it was very much not clear that the DPS was possible, even with a 30-second cast on the Big Bang. It was a fight that they started, both guilds started 6 healing, and to find the damage, one guild went to 5 heal, and one guild went to 4 heal to be able to actually kill this boss, and then healing this with 4 healers. I don't know how they did it. It was completely unreasonable, the amount of healing that was required on this fight as well. The Heart of the Wilds that they figured out, and defensives that they figured out so that people wouldn't die. It was crazy fight, but it was so satisfying that you have this boss that's just brutally difficult the whole way through, and then you get this burn at the end, and it's like, okay, you've made it through the fight. You've made it through the mechanics. Now it dies or you die. Super fun, super cool. S tier for me. Yeah, there we go. That's now entirely out of scrollability for me. Okay, we are nearly done here. Last row of mechanics. We have Lords of Dread. Lords of Dread actually has 2 mechanics for me. So this one also had a really cool Enrage kill to it, where you looked at the numbers of this and you're like, oh, this is not, the numbers aren't numbering here with this 9-minute Enrage, but it turned out there was a soulbind, if you were a Necrolord, called Bonesmith Hiremere, and when you died, you got 10 extra seconds as a suit of armor. You were doing like half damage, but you could stay alive for 10 extra seconds. And Echo figured out, okay, we can just have like 10 people or 6 people with Bonesmith take turns tanking the boss, because even though they were enraged, they were just autoing super hard, and you would just taunt the boss and avoid getting the cleave or whatever hitting other people and spin it away from the raid, and then go into Bonesmith form and kill the boss, 50 seconds into an enrage, which is absolutely crazy. Very cool to see. That was actually super iconic for the Race to World first. Not the way that almost anybody else actually killed this boss, but whatever. This is the point in WoW's history where I was super involved in the Race to World first, so I'm going to put the Race to World first mechanic up there into the S tier. The other mechanic that this boss had was pretty flawed, I would say, but it was also interesting. So this was Unto Darkness. The bosses would go into these carrion swarms and rotate around each other and do huge raid damage, but while they were doing this, they also took double damage, but only from AoE abilities, which was super cringe and weird. And some abilities that, mostly were used for single target were counted as AoE abilities and some weren't. So that was kind of weird. Some specs, like Survival Hunters, did really well against this because, like, randomly their single target abilities were AoE abilities, and then other specs got kind of owned on this. The comps that were used on this boss until this was changed were very lopsided towards specs that could abuse this. So I'll put this... It was still cool, but I'll put this into C tier. This boss had another mechanic that could have made this as well, the Among Us mechanic, where you had to figure out who the spy was in a sort of similar way to the Skitra image identification process. So a lot of cool mechanics here in Sepulchre. We've got 2 mechanics for the Jailer as well. The Blood of Azeroth was pretty cool. So at the start of the fight, the boss would smash this effigy of Azeroth in the middle of the room, which, lore-wise is kind of weird, but gameplay-wise it was pretty cool because the Azeroth's health bar would immediately get depleted to super low, and you had to heal Azeroth up by forming a link from the Blood of Azeroth to the Azeroth representation in the middle of the room. So you would have to form these chains of players and then touch the Blood of Azeroth, and it would chain this Azerite lightning through you to the to the Azeroth image in the middle of the room. That was super fun. You'd get a damage buff for doing it, but also it did more damage to you if you had stacks of this damage buff. And then later in the fight, you would get a 6 stack and lust with the 6 stack, and that was super fun and cool. During farm, you'd get a bunch of stacks. During Fated farm, you would get a bunch of stacks and just murder the boss with them. But it was really cool to do, really fun to execute. Really fiddly while you were learning it, but once you learned it, it was another one of those things where you're like, okay, we're doing something really hard. So I'm actually going to say this was a historic mechanic. Runes of Damnation, on the other hand, this was an iconically bad mechanic. So this was, the boss room had all these hexagons that you could fall into in it, and you would get these Runes of Damnation, and you'd have to jump into one of them as it was about to expire, and then it would explode harmlessly down there and knock you back up. But if 2 people jumped into the same one, they would take way lots of damage, and also, it would close the ones. Actually, it would create pillars that would then eventually close. But you could also use the pillars for line of sight for other mechanics that were in that phase on the ones that people jumped into. So you needed to have the 6 people that were targeted by Rune of Damnation within the 6 seconds of the rune, identify which one they were supposed to jump into and jump into that exact one. There was no realistic way to do this except with a weak aura spaceship UI HUD thing. Super cringe weak aura design for a fight. The kind of thing that this is part of the reason why Blizzard has tried to with private auras, wage war on weak auras solving these kinds of mechanics. But honestly, if you couldn't do this with weak auras, it would be even cringer. Trying to solve this exact mechanic without weak auras would suck. It would be really hard to do and really unsatisfying and really inconsistent. And there wasn't, like, in 6 seconds only, there was no way to do it better. And also randomly, if your shaman was in Ghost Wolf form, they would fall faster. They had rocks in their pockets and they would just die if they did that. So that was funny thing we discovered on that fight as well. All right, we move into the Dragonflight expansion. Up first, we have Senarth's Slippy Ground. This is a mechanic that was super annoying, but also pretty funny. I can't bring myself to F tier this mechanic. I'm going to C tier it, the Slippy Ground on Senarth. I mean, it was so funny. The funny part as well was, like, randomly 1 out of every 20 people, 1 person in every raid group would just be bugged to have their camera perma spin while they had the Slippy Floor on them on this fight. But yeah, it was kind of annoying to play around, but it was also experimental and again, very funny. All right, we move on to Razageth. Razageth's mythic mechanic, one of the mythic changes on this fight. So on Heroic and Normal, you'd get these lightning zones that you'd place in the ground, and then Razageth would beat her wings and knock you away from her, and it was a really tough knockback, but you could stand in the lightning ground, and it would ground you and keep you there. And that was cool. And then this boss got pulled on Mythic, and it would do the Winds cast. The first time it did the Winds cast, and there wasn't any lightning ground that you could stand in. And the boss was just knocking you back with the force of like 1,000 hurricane. I think it was literally called Hurricane Wing. And it would knock you off the platform. And if you were a priest or a paladin, good luck. And if you were anybody else, you still, like, you shadow step the boss, oops, the boss is spun the wrong way, you're getting knocked off the edge, so you had to, like, shadow step a person. Your evokers were deep breathing and dream breathing and rescuing and time spiraling. Evokers were really OP that tier because of this mechanic largely. Rescuing the priests and the paladins so that you could keep them alive. You were void elfing, you were doing all these different things to try and survive this. I was playing Prot Warrior, so it was pretty easy. Heroic Leap. Thanks to Time Spiral, Charge and Heroic Leap were both pretty good. And then I came and did this later on Blood Decay and, like, oh, it's even easier, Death's Advance. You just press that. But this still was super iconic. And again, one of those things where, like, yeah, this is a mythic fight, right? The Winds with no place to hold on. And then as the phase 1 got longer and longer, or went deeper into phase 1, Hurricane Wing would last longer with the successive casts. So the later ones would be so brutally hard to stay on. I remember our hunter he would be like running at full speed with Cheetah, and then at the very end of the last one, he would still get knocked off the platform and he would have to spin around and disengage back on in order to stay on. Crazy mechanic, super cool. All right, up next is Echo of Neltharion, the walls on this one. So this is a weird one. They broke line of sight in a weird way, and you had to break them by getting your tank knocked into them to open up these future sections of the room. But it was kind of weirdly executed, the way that it worked on Echo of Neltharion, because the boss would just keep rebuilding the walls as you broke them. I feel like there was a PTR version of this fight where you, I think, permanently broke walls as you broke them, and then you had to use them more for the line of sight they provided, so you could actually line of sight this explosion mechanic. That got changed when this boss went live, so the explosion mechanic instead ignored line of sight and was just a big circle around you, and you just had to open more of the room so that you had enough space to spread these big circles around. But then you had to spread them into very specific locations because each wall you broke stacked a dot on everybody, so you needed to break the exact minimum amount of walls, and it was an extremely precise way that you had to handle this mechanic. And I think there was a lot of potential for them to do something with this that wasn't the way that it turned out, but the way that it turned out was neither particularly fun to play nor particularly interesting. So I'm going to put this one into iconically bad as well. All right, up next is Scale Commander Sarkareth, the emptiness between the stars. Probably the best mechanic name of any of these mechanics. This was super cool. So you got shifted into the emptiness between the stars, which was represented by just kind of a darker version of the same room that you were phased into. On Mythic as well, every time you shifted between realms, you would leave a one-shot puddle that if somebody walked into, they would literally get one shot, which was pretty funny, and was a huge part of how you designed your Mythic strategy on that fight was around where you placed them. But even on the lower difficulties, you would shift into this realm, and you could take these bombs into the emptiness between the stars and have them explode there. While you were in the emptiness between the stars, you would collect these fragments that would give you a big buff of haste when you came back upstairs, and you could use that to just absolutely blast the boss. And on Mythic as well, you had these sections in the fight where 19 of your 20 players would go down into the emptiness between the stars, and they would drop some debuffs while they were down there and be safe from all the chaos that was happening upstairs, while your lone heroic tank, which was me, was fighting up there. It was just 1v1ing Sarkareth for 10 or 15 seconds, which was super fun. Very iconic tank fantasy of me against you, right? It's if I die, the entire raid explodes, and I hold the line. I'm gonna throw this up into S tier. I think this is super cool, and again, it was a little bit sort of like the Jailer with the manifestation of Azeroth. This was not the most epic looking way to represent an extremely epic concept, but it was an extremely epic concept and also a very fun mechanic to play for me. So I'm gonna throw it up an S tier because Sarkareth, I thought this mechanic was super fun. All right, we move on to Tindral with the Seeds mechanic. Now, I explained to you how the Halandris bomb mechanic worked on Mythic. The Tindral Seed mechanic was similarly crazy to Halandris and Anduin's Mythic mechanics. So the boss would spawn 16 seeds, each of which would wipe you if it wasn't soaked within 3 seconds of it appearing on the ground. Each person in your raid, you had 20 players in the raid, but 4 of them would often be busy doing a dragon riding section of the fight. So pretty much every single person in your raid was responsible for trying to soak a seed. But if you soaked a second seed, it would instantly wipe your raid. So 16 seeds go out. There are 20 players in your raid, but often only 16 of them could actually do these soaks in a few of the casts. You had 3 seconds to soak a seed as it spawned, but not soak a second one. But don't double. If you double, we wipe. So don't panic, but soak exactly one, but also don't double. And if any of that went wrong, you would spawn a tree out of the seed and it would just wipe your entire raid. This got nerfed several times. In fact, during Waste to World First progression, the phase 3 version of the seeds got nerfed to 5 seconds. Soon that would follow for the other phases after Waste to World First was over. They nerfed it down to 12 seeds from 16. They nerfed it so that you could walk over one and it just wouldn't soak it, but it also wouldn't instantly wipe you. But yeah, this mechanic was absolutely crazy. I think that it's one of the ones where I'm tempted to put it in S, but I think because I love these super hard mechanics, right? I put the Halandris bombs and stuff up here in S, but I think this one was a little bit too overcooked in difficulty for even me to justify putting it in S. My guild, we killed this. We killed it the week after it got the first post-Race to World First nerf. The Seeds mechanic, actually, I don't think was nerfed in that patch. Oh, no, it was. This was when they nerfed it to 5-second seeds across the board. But we had already progressed through. We had the boss at 9%, so we had done both the phases with the 3-second seeds successfully. And it was extremely satisfying, let me tell you. Getting through those phases, the first time we were flying to the phase 3 platform, it's wow, we've done 6 casts of 3-second seeds successfully. That feeling of being an orchestra putting together a piece of music that was far beyond what any one instrument was contributing, right? And you're kind of mind melded with your team, and you have this understanding of who's going to move to which seed where, and you're playing it as a group, and you're clenched thinking one is about to explode, and then somehow all seeds are soaked, and you're like, oh my God, we've done it. That was a crazy, crazy rewarding feeling. So I've talked myself into putting this S tier. I know, okay. Look. Objectively, it was way too hard, but I'm putting it S tier. I loved doing this so much. I loved the mechanic. It was so fun. Yeah, it was too hard. Yeah, it should have got nerfed more quicker, but I had such a great time playing against this mechanic. All right, slight oopsie. I should have done this one before. We've got Gnarl Roots, which this was a boss before Tindral. I've been trying to do this mostly in order. I think I've missed a couple of, boss ordering things here. But Gnarl Roots mechanic was actually pretty fun. This is another first boss mechanic that I think is going to go in the historic tier for me, because Gnarl Root joins the Terragru and maybe Vexy as being these kind of iconic, fun first bosses. And the Gnarl Root mechanic was you would get these roots and you would get caught. You'd have to catch this fire. You'd catch on fire and you would run over the roots and burn them. That was super, super fun to do. And then you'd get a damage amp phase on the boss as well as a reward for doing it. So, yeah, I don't know. Again, maybe this shouldn't have been in an iconic boss abilities tier list, but whatever, I'm doing it. Up next is Fire Axe Blazes. Fire Axe had the Seeds mechanic, which was an evolution of the Halandris bombs. But the mechanic I'll remember Fire Axe for actually is a different type of mechanic, which is Blazes. And this is where you'll get a line under you, and that line is going in a sort of random direction. And if you move, the line doesn't change with your character turning. It's always going to be, a north-south line or a northeast-southwest line, right? Something like that. And you just have to solve this mechanic by playing well. And the way you play well is it's a pretty quick mechanic. So if you do have some movement to do, you do that movement quickly and then you stop moving. And or if you have to move, you move along your line rather than perpendicular to it, so that the line doesn't catch people off guard by moving and hitting them with it. Really fun mechanic, something that they've actually used in both Nerebar Palace and in Liberation of Undermine. They did it in Nerebar Palace on Nexus Princess Kaiveza with the Regicide lines, and they did this in Chrome King Gallywix, actually, with the rockets that you shoot out. They're very similar to Blaze lines as well. Again, not quite the same, but I think this is actually a permanent addition to WoW now, is Blaze lines. I think it's a great mechanic. It's fun to play with, fun to do, not super hard, but there's a lot of tuning knobs for it to be fun, and it's satisfying to do without requiring you to develop a huge strategy. You just kind of learn a couple of quick rules for it, and then do those rules, execute the mechanic. I'm going to put this one in S tier as well. Can't stop me. We're almost near the end of the list. I've been doing this for hours now. My voice is getting a little hoarse. I'm throwing this in the S tier. All right, up next we have Queen Ansarek. Two mechanics from Queen Ansarek. One is the Essences. On Mythic, Essences, again, were a super crazy mechanic. This is one of those mechanics where the world top 5 or something dealt with the 12 Essence set, maybe 10, and then everybody else never did that. So in the last phase, you'd have these Acolytes, and you'd have 3, then 4, then 5. And they would drop these essences, which you would need to have somebody pick up and carry through a portal to avoid having them get hit by this Nova that the boss does. And then you need to drop them, and you need to drop them in a good spot so that they could be picked up again because they didn't go away. So the math on 3 plus 3 plus 4 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 is actually 22 total copies of this that need to get done. And the problem is that each time you do it, you get a debuff that says, hey, you take 5,000% or 500% more damage from this next time. So you're going to take a total of like 150 million damage over 15 seconds from this if you do it again. But there's 22 people that need to do this. You have 20 people in your raid. So it ended up being tanks that would do this, and you'd have a Flame Shaper Preservation Evoker give them a Renewing Blaze, and that would give them 70 million effective healing, and then they'd figure it out with defensives for the rest. That was super fun, though, super cool to do. We were progressing this version of the fight as well. We didn't kill it with this version, but we had strategy for it. We were getting ready to do this, and then they nerfed it so that you could have your debuffs fall off, and we also just realized that they nerfed the damage tech by enough that we can just kill the boss before we need to do the 12 set, and we just would do the 3 set and then the 7 set. The 7 set in and of itself was crazy as well. Like doing 7 essences was crazy. Doing 12, I can't believe the Race to World First guilds were able to make this work. It was such an incredible feat of execution from them. I don't think this mechanic makes it into the S tier for me. In fact, I'm not even sure it makes it into the A tier for me. It was a cool Race to World First mechanic. It was a little fiddly, very hard. I'd put it in the B tier. All right, up next is Web Blades. Web Blades were a pretty fun mechanic in theory. Had a little bit of a fatal flaw to it. So on Mythic, until they nerfed it, there would be 4 every time the boss cast it, and the boss would cast this super often. Among the nerfs they did to this boss fight, they made it so that every set went from 4 to 3 web blades, and they also removed several of the hardest web blade overlaps. But when you'd get these web blades, there would be some spots in phase 3 where it's like web blades, dodge orbs, do essences, web blades again, and you would have to handle all of that all at once while killing all these different ads as well. And the web blades were crazy because they would spawn and it would be like web blade spawn, web blade spawn, web blade spawn, web blade spawn, and then web blade slice, and all 4 of them would slice, a couple of seconds after. It was incredibly difficult to dodge. You had to sort of remember in your mind the order that they'd spawned if you needed to dodge between them. But the problem with this mechanic was the visual on the ground went away before the damage happened. And so it was really awkward because you could dodge in, you'd see the visual go away and you'd be like, okay, now it's safe to move there, but it actually wasn't safe to move there yet. And for me, that, I'm not going to put it in iconically bad, but that keeps it down in the C tier for me as a mechanic. The fact that the ground telegraphing of this was so frustrating in that way. And then finally, we have one mechanic from Liberation of Undermine that's going to make this list. It's a little too close for me to really think about which mechanics I'm going to remember as iconic even from Nerebar Palace, but also from Liberation of Undermine. But I've chosen 6 Bunk Junkers balls mechanic, where you get some people on balls, they have to roll over trash, they have to roll over scrap masters, they have to roll into bombs, or they can roll into the boss and do a bunch of damage to the boss. Super fun, super inspired mechanic. Surprisingly difficult boss, although I don't think this mechanic is the culprit here. I actually think that the territorial bombshells are the main culprit for why this boss was so absurdly hard on Mythic compared to its position in the raid, and also just the damage of the scrap masters and the prototype power coils blasting into somebody. But the balls definitely didn't help as well. There were like 5 really hard mechanics here. I think the balls should have been the only hard mechanic on this boss on Mythic, and I think then it would have been appropriate for a 4th boss. But the balls mechanic was actually really sick. I'm going to throw it up into the A tier as well. I might regret this later. Looking back in a couple years' time, maybe I'll be wanting this to be higher or lower. I'm not sure. But I'm going to throw it into A tier for now. Anyways, this is it. I've done it. I've finished my tier list of the most iconic WoW boss abilities. I've missed some. As I've been doing this, I've thought of several that I've missed. I missed the underwater boss in Eternal Palace. I missed all kinds of abilities. Let me know which ones I've missed down in the comments below. Let me know what you think of all this. I hope you've enjoyed this content as well. Big shout out to Franck for making this tier list as well. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Bye.